Chapter 26 of Olga Romanoff by George Griffith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sentence of Death. At 10 o'clock on the following morning, the great temple of Area was filled by a congregation of men and matrons who had been summoned together to hear what may, without exaggeration, be described as the death sentence of the world, and the funeral oration of the human race. As had been previously decided by the President and Council, only the heads of families were present. Of these, some had but just welcomed their firstborn into the world, while others, standing almost on the brink of the grave, could see their children of the fourth generation growing up from infancy to youth. When the President commenced his address by reading in solemnly impressive tones the prophecy of Natas, those present knew instinctively what they had been called together to hear. The possibility of the world being overwhelmed by such tremendous catastrophe in the fifth generation from the year of the peace was no new or unawaited prospect to the Aryans. Therefore there was no panic, no sudden outburst of sorrow or dismay among the grave, earnest congregation assembled in the temple, when the President, having read the prophecy, went on to say, "It is now my solemn duty as Chief Magistrate of Area to tell you, the heads of the families of our race, that, in the mysterious workings of destiny, which we can only accept with reverence and resignation, the time has come for us to prepare to meet, with the fortitude worthy of our position among the races of mankind, the doom which is as inevitable as it is universal. The confirmation of the prophecy of Natas has come to us across the abyss of space, from one of those sister worlds which, as the Master said, should see with fear and trembling the passing of the messenger of fate. On the night of Tuesday last, Facilis Cosmo received from the planet Mars a photogrammic message, the transcript of which into our language reads thus: "A cometary body primarily formed by the meeting of two extinguished astral spheres at 10 hours 38 minutes 42 seconds on the night of the 13th of October in the year 1920, terrestrial reckoning, will cross the orbit of the Earth at 11 hours 55 minutes 22 seconds on the night of the 23rd of September next, time corrected to the meridian of Area. At this hour, the Earth will arrive at the point of intersection, and will pass obliquely through the central portion or nucleus of the body. This portion is composed of incandescent metallic gases, interspersed with semi-fluid masses, which on contact with the Earth's atmosphere will probably be vaporized. The constituents of the incandescent nucleus are iron, gold, tellurium, chromium, oxygen, nitrogen and carbon, with smaller quantities of many other substances, which spectrum analysis will disclose to you on the appearance of the comet, which will become visible for Area at 8 hours 13 minutes p.m. on the 15th of July, when its right ascension will be 15 hours 24 minutes 17 seconds, and its declination north 10 degrees 42 minutes 17 seconds. Here follow the detailed calculations upon which the foregoing conclusions are based. With these calculations," continued the President, "this is neither the time nor the place to deal, for I know that all here will be satisfied when I say that for the last 3 days they have been submitted to the critical examination of our best astronomers and mathematicians, and that not the slightest flaw has been found in them. This being so, the only course left open to us as reasonable beings is to prepare to look the inevitable in the face, and to play our part in the closing scene of the life drama of humanity, as men and women who believe that the life we are living here is but a stage on our journey through infinity, and that the fiery sign which will soon appear in the heavens will be to us but a beacon of light on the ultimate shore of time, casting a guiding ray over the ocean of eternity." He paused for a moment and looked down upon the hushed throng at his feet. The instantaneous silence was broken by a long, low, inarticulate murmur. Thousands of pale faces were turned upwards towards him. From thousands of eyes there came one appealing upward glance, and then every head in the great assembly was bowed in silence and resignation. The death sentence had been passed. There was no appeal from it, and there was no rebellion against it. The voice of fate had spoken, and it was not for such men as the Aryans to sacrifice their reason or their dignity by cavilling at it. The president bent his head with the rest, and for several moments there was silence throughout the vast area of the temple. Then he took up from the desk in front of the rostrum the 4 sheets of parchment, which contained the last message, the commands of Natas, and read them out to the assembly. The perusal was listened to in breathless silence. It was like his voice speaking across the generations from the urn containing his ashes and standing there in their midst. When the president had finished, he laid the sheets down again and said, "Thus, the eye of the master, looking across the years which separate his day from ours, has seen one gleam of light, one ray of hope piercing the black pall of desolation which is about to fall upon the world. And it is for us to follow where he has pointed the way. I have now discharged the first part of the solemn and terrible duty which has devolved upon me. It is now for you to communicate the tidings you have heard to your families, a task which, however awful it may be for loving parents to be charged with, you will find strength to perform, even as your children shall find strength to hear their inevitable doom from those lips which will best know how to soften the tidings of death to them. When you have done this, we will set about making the choice of those who, if it shall please the Master of Destiny, shall be the children of deliverance, and the parents of the new race that shall repeople the earth when cosmos once more succeeds to chaos. If that shall be permitted, then we, who shall never see the new world, may yet go down to the grave knowing that we will live again in our children. For those will be the children, not only of a few families among us, but sons and daughters of Aeria, the most perfect flower of our race. And in them, if we choose them wisely, the world, purged by the fire of the dross of human wickedness, will find a new destiny, and the golden age shall return to earth once more." As the president finished speaking, he held up his hands as though in blessing, and once more every head was bent. Then the great doors of the temple swung open, and assembly divided into 4 streams and passed silently, as a congregation of shadows, out of the building. That night, the story of the world's approaching doom was told in every home in Aeria. Children on the threshold of youth learnt that for them youth would never come. Youths and maidens on the verge of manhood and womanhood learnt that the bright promise of their lives could now never be fulfilled. And lovers, just about to join hands for life, saw the grave opening at their feet, and parted them in their earthly personalities for ever. That they would meet again upon a higher plane of existence was the first and most firmly held article of their faith. But so far as the affairs of this world were concerned, the end was in sight. In a less highly developed, a less perfectly organized state of society, the almost immediate result would have been the end of all control, and the dissolution of all but the most elementary bonds of interest or affection that exist between men and men. But in Aeria this was not possible. The firm belief ingrained into the very being of all who had reached the age of thought, that where men left off here, whether in good or evil, they would begin their lives again hereafter, precluded even the thought of such a lapse into social anarchy and individual sin. For, happily for them, the union of true religion with true philosophy had now been accomplished in a national faith, and the result was that even the terrors of the universal end which was so near failed to shake the fortitude that was founded on a basis firmer than that of the world itself. Though every home in the valley had its tragedy that night, a tragedy too sacred in its unspeakable solemnity for any mere words to describe it. When the next morning came, the first bitterness of death had already passed. Saving only the little children, who, too young to understand, laughed and played and sang in the sunlight as usual, in happy unconsciousness of their coming fate, the dwellers in Area rose with the next sunrise from their sleepless couches and went about their daily associations much as they had the day before. They did so rather as a matter of routine and discipline than of necessity, for now nothing more was necessary on earth. They had ample supplies of food to last them beyond the time when they would have no more need of it. It was of no use to dress the gardens and vineyards, or to till the fields that would be blasted into wilderness before the harvest could be reaped. There was no need to pursue further the triumphs of creative art and science which had transfigured Area into a paradise and a fairyland, for in a few weeks all these would be crumbled to dust with their own sepulchres. And yet they took up the work that lay nearest to their hands and went on with it as though they believed that there were still ages of life before humanity, and that the empire of Area was to endure for ever. They knew that in work only lay the refuge from the torment of apprehension which might in the end drive even their highly disciplined minds into the delirium of despair and transform their orderly paradise into a pandemonium of anarchy and terror. As soon as the first shock of inevitable horror had passed, as it did during that first terrible night when the death sentence went from lip to lip throughout the land, their proud spirits rose superior to their physical fears and conquered them, and they resolved that, until the fatal hour came, nothing short of the dissolution of the world should put an end to social order in Area. They were the royal race of earth, and when death came, they would meet it crowned and sceptred in the gates of their palaces, and die as men who had solved the secret of life and death, and so had no fear. With the war that was raging beyond their borders, they had now no personal concern. The quarrels of men and nations were as the bickerings of children in the presence of the fate that would so soon involve the world in ruin. And yet the rulers of Area were not willing that this fate should overtake their fellow men in the delirium of blood drunkenness. They recognized that their duty to the nations bade them send the warnings of the world's approaching fate far and wide through the earth, and call for the cessation of strife, so that humanity might set its house in order and prepare to meet its end. Whether the warning would be received or not was another matter. It was possible that both the Tsarina and the Sultan would laugh it to scorn, and pursue their path of now certain conquest through carnage and devastation to the end. That, however, was their concern. As soon as the council decided to dispatch an envoy to summon the warring nations to cease their strife for the now more than ever worthless prize of earthly empire, and to prepare for the cataclysm which would so soon dissolve all empires and kingdoms to nothing in the fiery crucible of the coming chaos, Alan at once renewed his petition, and asked to be allowed to man the Avenger with a crew of volunteers and convey the warning to the Sultan and the Tsarina. Since his second return to Area, no word of love had passed between him and Alma. He was still too proud to become a suitor even to her, knowing as he did that she had looked upon him as polluted by his involuntary relations with Olga. As before, they had met as friends whose friendship was warmed by the memory of an early but bygone love. They had talked calmly and dispassionately of the coming end of earthly things, but neither of them had let fall any hint of a desire to meet it hand in hand with the other. His lips were sealed by the pride and anger of humiliation, and hers by a spiritual exaltation, which, in the presence of approaching death, raised her above the consideration of earthly love to the contemplation of even more solemn and holier things. Then there happened an entirely unexpected event, which completely changed their relationship in an instant. On the third day after the delivery of the message in the temple, a company composed of 20 old men, the heads of the noblest families in area, presented to the president in council a petition signed by every father and mother in the nation, praying that all in whose veins flowed the blood of Natas, Richard Arnold, and Alan Tremaine should, irrespective of all other considerations, be included among those who were destined to seek in the caverns of Mount Austral the one chance of escape from the universal doom. So obvious and so weighty were the reasons advanced in support of the petition that when, like all other matters of state, it was put to the vote of the council, the only dissentient voices were those of the president and the vice-president. The immediate effect of this decision, from which by the law of area there was no appeal, was that Alma, Isma, and Alan were exempted from the ordeal of selection, and numbered beforehand among the children of deliverance. The president took upon himself the duty of communicating this decision to those whom it so deeply concerned. He told Alan first, and this was the half-expected reply that he received. "No, father, I have never disobeyed you or the council, as you know, but I tell you now frankly that I will not take advantage of what is, after all, only the accident of birth, to save my life in such a crisis as this. Not only are there thousands of others in area as good as I am, but I have already told you that save under one condition, which you know as well as I do, can never be realized, I have not the slightest desire to survive the ruin of the world. You may call this disobedience, rebellion if you will, but it is my last resolve, and in such a time as this one does not make resolves lightly." Alan said this standing facing his father in his private study. The president looked at him for a moment or two with eyes which, though grave, were neither reproving nor reproachful. Then he said, with the shadow of a smile upon his lips, "It is both disobedience and rebellion, my son. But though the chief magistrate must condemn it, your father cannot. I know, too, that not even the council of area can now enforce its commands. After all, the last penalty is but death, and that is a mockery now. I fully understand, too, the spirit in which you refuse the reprieve from the general doom, and prefer instead a mission which can scarcely end save in honourable death. It is the most noble one that you can choose, and you of all other men are the man to perform it. You have shown our enemies that you can strike hard in battle, so if they believe anyone they will believe you, when you go to them with a message of peace enforced by such a solemn warning as you will take." "Thank you, father," replied Alan simply, "not for what you say of me, but for the consent that your words imply. But what about the airship and her crew? I can do nothing without them, yet I cannot have them without the consent of the council. Can you get that for me?" "I believe so," said the president. "And if I can, I will, since you are resolved to go, and since the honour of our name compels me to consent. But I must tell you that I feel sure that it will only be given conditionally." "And what will the condition be?" "That if you survive a mission, you will return to area before the end comes. They will have a right to demand that, for it is no part of your duty to deprive your companions of the chance of life, slender though it may be, that will remain for those who may be among the chosen." "That is true," replied Alan, bending his head in acquiescence. "If we escape with our lives, they shall return, though I shall not." "You will not return, Alan? Why, where are you going? Surely you are not going to leave area again, and at such a time as this, you, who are already one of the chosen, a first-born son of the master's line." It was Alan's mother who spoke. She had entered the room just as he had uttered the last sentence, and the ominous words struck a sudden chill to her heart. She came towards him with her eyes full of tears, of apprehension, and her hands stretched out pleadingly towards him. Now that the first terror of crisis was past, and there was one definite, however slender, hope of safety. She clung to it passionately for Alan's sake, with a faith that made light of all the fearful difficulties which lay in the way of its realization. In the sublime egotism of her mother-love, the fate of the world shrank into insignificance in comparison with the one chance of safety for her only son. "Yes, mother," replied Alan, taking her hands in his and bending down until his lips touched her upturned brow. "I am going to leave Aeria again, to proclaim the truce of God against the hour of his judgment, and I have just told my father that I shall not return." "No, no, my boy, you must not say that. You must not rob us of the one ray of light in this awful darkness that is falling upon us, of our one hope in the world's despair," cried his mother, letting go his hands and laying her own upon his shoulders as she looked up into his face with eyes that were now overflowing with tears. "You will not leave us now, surely, for if we lost you, we could not even take the chance of life ourselves, for it would not be worth having." "Nor would it be worth having, my mother, either to you or to me," he replied, gently laying his hands on hers. "If I lived and left untried the attempt that is my plain duty to make, you would see me a lonely and unmated man among the parents of the new race, a man with a shadow upon his name and the memory of an unfulfilled duty behind him. Remember that it is I who have brought the guilt of blood back again upon earth. Would you have me outlive all the millions of my fellow creatures, with the knowledge that I had not made one effort to bring back that peace on earth, which was lost through me before the last summons comes to all humanity?"
"Alan is right, wife," interrupted the President, before she could make any reply to her son's appeal. "It is his duty to save, if he can, his fellow creatures from being overwhelmed in the midst of their madness and their sin. Remember that according to our faith, as all these millions who are now drunk with battle and slaughter, and mad with the rage of conquest and revenge, end this life, so they must begin the next. There is time for him to speak and for them to hear, but whether they hear him or not, if he has spoken, he has done his duty. Is it not better that if he needs to be, he should die doing it than live and leave it undone?" The weighty words, spoken as they were in a tone of blended affection and authority, found a fitting echo in his wife's breast. She stood for a moment between her husband and her son, looking from the one to the other. Then she dried her tears and replied in a tone of gentle dignity and resignation, "Yes, I see. You are right and I was wrong. It is his duty to go, and he must go. But," she continued, turning to Alan with the sudden light of a new hope in her eyes, "if I bid you Godspeed, my son, you will promise one thing, won't you?" "Yes, mother, I will, whatever it is." "Then promise me that if it shall be proved possible for you to live in happiness as well as in honour, you will come back." "Yes," he replied, smiling gravely as he once more took her outstretched hands. "I will promise that, as gladly as I would promise to enter heaven if I saw the gates open before me." "Then you shall go, and God go with you and bring you back in safety to us," she said. Then turning abruptly, she went out of the room, leaving them both wondering at her words. This took place early on the morning of the 21st of May. An hour later the President had applied in Alan's name for the permission of the Council for him to select a crew of 20 volunteers, and to take the Avenger to Europe on his mission to the warring peoples, and to proclaim peace on earth and breathing space for humanity to prepare for its end. But then a new difficulty presented itself. Alexis, in spite of Alan's remonstrances to the contrary, declared that he should never leave Aeria without him. "I have shared in your exile and your return," he said in answer to all arguments, "and by the honour of the Golden Wings, I swear that I will either go with you now, or you shall see me fall dead the moment that you leave the earth." This was the only oath that ever was heard upon the lips of an Aerian,
and it was irrevocable. So, as there was no choice, Alan was forced to consent, and Alexis made ready to bid a last farewell to Aeria and all its dear associations. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Olga Romanoff by George Griffith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alma speaks. That night, Alan, with his heart too full even for the society of his own home, went out of the city a little before midnight and walked down towards the western shore of the lake, where there still stood the same grove of palms in which more than 130 years before Natasha and Richard Arnold had plighted their despairing troth, and under the shadow of what threatened to be an eternal separation, spoke the first words of love that had ever passed their lips. It was not altogether accident that guided his steps in this direction, for all day he had been reviewing the strange chain of events which united the fate of his ancestors with his own, and it was natural that the most romantic episode in their lives should inspire him with a desire to see the scene of it once more. So it came about that he stood on what he believed to be his last night in Aeria beneath the self-same ancient palms, which 5 generations before had heard Natasha confess her love for the man who had sworn to give her in exchange for it that empire of peace which he, their descendant, had been the means of losing. The story was, of course, familiar to him in its minutest detail. And as he stood there, his own heavy heart, with a hopeless sorrow, he pictured his great ancestor standing on the same spot, holding the means of universal conquest in his hands, and yet accounting all things as worthless, because the empire within his grasp must lack the supreme crown of a woman's love. Then, looking back through the mists of the years that had gone by since then, he seemed to see the very shape of the angel moving over the soft green sward, where now the broad marble-paved roadway gleamed white beneath the trees, and to hear the musical murmur of her voice, even as Richard Arnold had heard it on that eventful night. Alan! Was he dreaming, or was it the voice of his ancestress speaking to his soul in that hour of his lonely sorrow? A pale, shimmering, ghostly shape flitted across the quivering plumes of the palm trees, dropped softly to the ground, and Alma stood before him in the well of her aerial boat. Before his amazement had permitted him to utter a word, she had stepped out and was coming towards him with outstretched hands, saying, "They told me I should find you here, Alan. I have come to ask you to forgive me if you, before you go upon this mission of yours, if go you must." "To forgive you, Alma?" he exclaimed, recoiling a pace in sheer astonishment at her presence and her words. "What can I have to forgive you? Is it not rather—" "No, Alan, it's not," she said quickly, still holding out her hands to him, and looking up at him with faintly flushing cheeks and shining eyes. "I see it all clearly now. Isma was right. It is I who have sinned against you, and it is for me to ask forgiveness." "How can you ask that of me, Alma? How have you harmed me?" he asked, still bewildered by her beauty and the enigmas that she spoke in, yet taking her hands and, as if by instinct, drawing her towards him. "I will answer that afterwards," she said quickly, as though inspired by some sudden thought. "But tell me first, are you quite resolved to go upon this mission?" "Yes," he said, with an almost imperceptible quiver in his voice. "Have I not had a great, if not guilty, share in bringing this curse upon the world? And is it not fitting that I should give my last days to the task, however hopeless, of bringing back peace on earth, so that men may die sane and not mad?" "But, Alan, is that a higher duty than you owe to your family and your people? You know that in you centre all the hopes for the future, if there is to be one. With you would die the name of Arnold, the direct line of Natasha.
and with me they would die even if I went with the children of deliverance into the caverns of Mount Austral, and survived the ruin of the world. How can you mock me like that, Alma? Have I not suffered enough for my weakness and my folly, that you would condemn me to wander an exile in the wilderness, that the world will be when it has passed through its baptism of fire? What is the swift death of battle, or the short agony of the conflagration of the world compared with the long death in life that I should drag out alone in the new world that may arise from the ruins of this one? And why alone, Alan? Why alone? Can you ask me that, Alma? Surely you are mocking me now. Can you ask why I should be alone if I survived with the remnant of our people? Do you not even yet know why I choose the certainty of death rather than the challenge of life? But, Alan, what if I were to tell you that you would not go alone to the caverns, and that if the chosen few survive, you will not wander alone on the wilderness of the new world? I should tell you, Alma, that you meant to sacrifice yourself to save me, and that I would not accept the sacrifice even at your hands. Sacrifice? No, Alan. I would not outlive the world even with you on those terms. A woman of area does not sell herself even for sentiment. This is no time for secrets or false shame. And I tell you frankly that if you had accepted the order of the council, you should have lived, and I would have died. But your rebellion proved to me that Isma was right when she rebuked my false pride by saying, "The man who has fallen and risen again is better and stronger than he who has never suffered." But, Alma, remember, no, you must not interrupt me now, or what ought to be said may never be spoken. I know what you were going to say. You were going to tell me to remember that Olga Romanoff is still alive. Let her live, and let God judge her for her sins in the judgment that is so soon to come. What have we to do with her? Nothing, Alma, after you have said that, for it tells me that in your eyes the stain is purged and the fault forgiven. I will take the message to her as to the rest of the world. If she receives it in peace, then there shall be peace, and God shall judge between us. And if not, then I will pit my single ship against hers, and her fleet, and only one of us, if either, shall see the end. And if that is you, what then? Then it will be for you, under heaven, to speak the words of life or death, for only you can bid me live, Alma.
As he spoke, the great lights of the mountain top suddenly blazed out, shone for a few moments, and were extinguished again. It was the answering signal to one from Mars, but it joined two souls as well as two worlds. For by its light Alan saw on Alma's face, and in her eyes, the one reprieve from death that honour would permit him to accept. Without waiting for the words that her now smiling lips were opening to utter, he took her unresisting in his arms. Then her proudly carried wing-crowned head drooped at last in sweet submission and rested on his heart, and as he turned her face up to his to take her kiss of re-betrothal, he said, "That tells me that I may live. Now we are immortal, you and I, for this kiss is our eternity." Then their lips met, and for the instant time had no more beginning or end. The impending ruin of the world was forgotten, for love had spoken, and the very voice of doom itself was silent amidst the happiness of their heedless souls. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Olga Romanoff by George Griffith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Sign in the Sky. When the news of what had happened at midnight in the palm grove was published the next morning far and wide through the valley of Area, it would have been impossible to imagine that an irrevocable sentence of death was overhanging the land and all its inhabitants, save those who were to be selected to take the one chance that remained of surviving the chaos that was to come. There was no one in the valley to whom Alan's story was not familiar in all its details. There was not a single heart that had not, in the midst of its own happiness, sympathized with him and Alma in their sorrow, and so, when that sorrow was at last turned into joy, everyone forgot for the moment the fate for whose approach was so near and so certain, and rejoiced with them in the happiness that was great enough to raise them above the gloom that was already stealing over the world. But in the midst of the general rejoicing came the decision of the council upon the request which Alan had submitted to his father, and this, though he was forced to confess it wise and just, was by no means what, in his enthusiasm, he could have wished. The rulers of Area absolutely refused to permit any of the airships to leave the valley for at least 2 months to come. They recognized with perfect approval the nobility of the resolve which Alan had taken to carry the message of the world's approaching end to those nations which he had been, partially at least, responsible for plunging into the horrors of war. But they insisted that the concerns of Area must, in their eyes, take precedence of those of the outside world. There was much to do, and the time for doing it was short. What was perhaps the greatest engineering task in the history of the world had to be conceived and completed within the next 4 months. And as Alan and Alexis were admittedly the 2 most skillful practical engineers in the state, the council declined to allow them to run the almost certain risk of death at the hands of their enemies, when their knowledge and skill ought to be devoted to the work of ensuring, as far as possible, the preservation of that remnant of the human race who should be destined to seek safety in the caverns of Mount Austral. When the completion of that work was made certain, then permission would be freely given to them and their companions to go forth and proclaim their warning to the world, subject only to the condition that they were to take every precaution consistent with the honour of their race to return, while there was yet time for them to take their place among the children of deliverance, should the selection fall upon them. Meanwhile, telephonic messages were to be sent to all those portions of the world with which Area was still in communication, conveying the exact terms of the warning that had been received from Mars, and calling upon the astronomers in all the observatories on the globe to verify the calculations for themselves, and publish their conclusions to the respective nations as quickly as possible. With these terms, Alan was of necessity obliged to be content. Indeed, when he came to review them in sober thought, he saw that while nothing was to be lost, much was to be gained by submission to them. Though he still refused, even in spite of the knowledge that he would share with Alma in the future if there was to be one, to obey the order of the council which exempted him from the ordeal of selection, he thought and worked with just as much ardour as though the safety of the whole of the dwellers in Area, as well as his own, hung upon his efforts. The caverns of Mount Austral, like those of other limestone formations in various parts of the world, had been formed in some remote geological period by the solvent action of water, charged with carbonic gas upon the limestone rocks. The entrance to them, discovered very soon after the valley had been colonized by the terrorists in the first decade of the 20th century, was situated on the inner slopes of the mountain, about 800 feet above the level of the lake, which occupied the central portion of the valley. This lake, although fed by hundreds of streams from the surrounding mountains, always preserved the same level, in spite of the fact that it had no visible outlet. Those who first explored the caverns found the explanation of this phenomenon. Below the floors of the vast chambers which penetrated the heart of the mountain for a distance of nearly 3 miles, there ran a deep chasm, through which rushed in a black, swift, silent stream the surplus water of the lake. This stream was nearly 1,000 feet below the entrance to the caverns, and half that distance below the floor of the lowest chambers and galleries. The scheme conceived by Alan and Alexis and their fellow workers was in fact nothing less than the damming of this subterranean stream by a mighty sluice gate, composed of one huge sheet of metal which, running down into grooves cut in the solid rock and metal sheathed, should completely close the inner mouth of the tunnel by which the waters entered the caverns. This, once successfully fixed in its place, would deprive the lake of its only known outlet. The streams would go on flowing from the mountains, and the waters of the lake would rise. The upper entrance would, when the fatal moment came, also be closed, not by one such door, but by 3 that would slide down one behind the other in the upper tunnel, which, with a diameter of about 30 feet and a height of almost 50, ran for nearly 1/4 of a mile from the side of the mountain to the first of the chambers. The spaces between these doors would be filled with ice artificially frozen, and shafts to allow for expansion should the ice melt, and the water boil would run from them vertically, piercing the mountain side. When the waters rose to the level of the entrance, the doors would be lowered and the space filled with water and frozen. Then the waters would go on rising. The entrance would be submerged, and the defences of the fortress in which the remnant of humanity was to make its last stand for life would be complete. But in addition to these outer defences, there was an enormous amount of work to be done in fitting the interior of the caverns to receive those for whom they were to form an asylum. They were already lighted by myriads of electric lamps, but the source of light was outside, and this had to be replaced by power stations inside. Provision had to be made for keeping the air pure and vital, for supplying food and drink for almost an indefinite time, and for storing up a sufficiency of seeds and roots and treasures of art and creative skill, so that the new world might be clothed again with verdure and nothing essential of the splendid civilization of Area be lost. Such, in the briefest outline, was the momentous task to which the Aryans devoted all their splendid genius and unconquerable energies, and day by day and week by week they toiled at it, while the fatal hour which was to witness the last agony of man upon earth swiftly drew nearer and nearer. The messages to the outside world had been sent and replied to. Those to the astronomers and to the governments of the Federation had been acknowledged in formal terms, which thinly concealed the incredulity with which they had been received. Olga had treated the message with the silent disdain of a conquering autocrat, such as in sober truth she now was. The Sultan had replied to it in a dispatch in which the dignity of a victorious despot and the fatalism of the religious fanatic was characteristically blended. Then one by one the telephonic communications with the various parts of the world ceased. Messages were sent out and repeated, but no answer came back. First Europe, then Britain, then South Africa, America and Australia ceased to respond to the signals. And by the beginning of July, Area was completely isolated from the rest of the world, probably the only stronghold that now remained unsubdued by the conquering fleets of the Sultan and Tsarina. Still, the sentinel ships hanging high in the air over the valley, and constantly patrolling the outer slopes of the mountains, saw no sign of hostile approach. The last message that had been received from the great cities of the Federation had told brief but fearful stories of the desolation that was following in the path of Muslim and Russian conquest. The bridges of Gibraltar and the Bosphorus had been forced, and thousands after thousands of Muslim troops had been poured into Europe. Frenzied by fanaticism and the newborn lust of battle and conquest, the hordes of Asiatic tribesmen who had escaped the one terrific onslaught of the fleet under the command of Alexis had, now that the guardian ships were withdrawn, been hurried through Russia and hurled upon the wealthy and most defenceless cities of Western Europe. The Federation was on the point of utter collapse, divided in its councils, confused in its plan of defence, its armies undisciplined and its fleets disorganized and daily diminishing in numbers and effectiveness. In America, Australia and Southern Africa there was anarchy on earth and terror in the air. Cities had been terrorized into capitulation by aerial squadrons, and then looted and burnt, and their ruins given up to be the miserable prey of the revolutionaries who now, as ever, had taken advantage of the universal panic to revolt against all governments, and deny all rights but that which they claimed, to prey upon the helpless, all liberty that was not license, and all property that was not plunder. The last tidings of all that came from Europe
were received from Britain, and after recounting the destruction of London and the collapse of the government, concluded with the news that Olga had publicly embraced the faith of Islam, and in conjunction with the Sultan, whom she was to marry as soon as the conquest of Europe was finally complete, was forcibly converting her Russian subjects to the creed of the Koran. So the affairs of the world stood when the sun went down on the 15th of July. On the meridian of area it set at 9 minutes to 8. At 13 minutes past 8, according to the calculations made by the Martian and verified by the Aryan astronomers, the herald of fate would approach within range of terrestrial vision. Before the brief period of tropical twilight had passed, every telescope in the valley was turned to that spot in the constellation of Andromeda at which it was predicted to become visible. As the revolving earth swept area into the shadow of night, every light was extinguished, for it was known that the astronomers of Mars would be anxiously watching for a signal that would announce the correctness or the error of their calculations. Vasilis Cosmo, seated at the eyepiece of the great equatorial telescope on Mount Austral, with his hand on the switch which controlled the electric currents that were waiting to do his bidding, watched the fields of space darken and the stars of Andromeda shine out. Just a little below the line which joins the square of Pegasus with the constellation of Cassiopeia, he saw, as usual, the oval, luminous cloud of the great nebula in Andromeda. 4 degrees towards the zenith, above the centre of the star cloud, a tiny fan-shaped spray, faint and pale as a dissolving puff of white smoke, was floating in the black abyss of space. Precisely at the 13th minute of the hour he turned the switch, and the great suns on the mountain tops blazed out and flashed the signal to the sister world to tell its inhabitants that their prediction had been fulfilled to the second. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Olga Romanoff by George Griffith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Truce of God. By the 30th of July, the work in the caverns was so far advanced that the council was able to authorize the departure of Alan and his companions for the outside world. The great vertical sluice door, a huge sheet of steel 40 feet long, 20 wide and 18 inches thick, and footed with a great India-rubber pad, was in its place, suspended at the top of the steel-lined grooves which had been sunk 3 feet into each of the rock walls of the chasm, into which the water tunnel from the lake opened. On the morning of the 30th it was sent down into its final position. The momentous experiment proved completely successful. The huge mass of metal descended slowly over the mouth of the tunnel into the black swift stream at the bottom of the chasm. As its enormous weight crushed the India-rubber pad down into all the inequalities of the floor, the outrush of the water instantly stopped, and the channel ran dry, save for the fierce jets of water which spouted out over the top of the plate. The crevices through which these came were easily plugged, and when this was done it was found that the waters of the lake were rising at the rate of 3 feet an hour. This proved that, whether the lake had another outlet or not, the damming of the subterranean channels would be quite sufficient to flood the whole valley. The gate was then raised again, and the waters permitted to flow as before. The triple doors at the entrance to the cavern were already in position when this was done, as the task of placing them had necessarily been much easier than the construction of the water gate. Nothing but details now remained to be completed, and there was therefore no reason for any further postponement of Alan's mission. Alexis had also succeeded in carrying his point, and getting permission to accompany Alan in the Isma. He had had no difficulty in satisfying the council that the risk would be enormously diminished by sending 2 airships instead of 1, for while Alan descended to the earth to convey his message to a hostile city, he would be able to remain in the air, dominating it with his guns, and ready to lay it in ruins if the flag of truce were not respected. But the 2 friends had gained even more than this, for in answer to their earnest pleadings, in which it may be suspected they were not altogether unsupported by those as vitally concerned as themselves, a joint family council had decided that, under the unparalleled circumstances of the case,
there was no valid reason for refusing consent to their immediate union with the two faithful brides who had waited so long and so patiently for their lords. Therefore, on the morning of the 31st, it came to pass that they stood upon the spot sanctified by the ashes of their great ancestors, and took each other for man and wife, for life or death, as the hazard of the world's fate might decide, in the presence of a vast congregation of those who stood with feet already touching the brink of the valley of the shadow of death. No bridal so strange or solemn had ever been celebrated in the world before. It was human love and hope and genius, serene and confident in the presence of the most awful catastrophe that had ever befallen humanity, defying the fate that was about to overwhelm a world in destruction. That evening, as the sun was touching the tops of the western mountains, the last preparations for the voyage were completed, the last farewells exchanged, and the Isma and the Avenger, now named the Alma, by the hands of her name-mother, rose into the air amid salvos of aerial artillery and winged their way northward over the ridge. As they sped out over the plains of northern Africa, the sun sank, and out of the northwestern heavens shone the luminous haze of the fire cloud, which had now grown in visible magnitude until the two fan-like wings which spread out from its central nucleus spanned an arc of 20 degrees in the heavens. As the two airships sped on their northward course towards Alexandria, where Alan had decided to make his first attempt to stay the progress of the world war, the two pairs of new wedded lovers watched with anxious eyes from the decks of their flying craft the terrible portent in the skies, whose meaning they above all others on earth were so well qualified to read. There could be no doubt now, even apart from all the elaborate calculations which had been made, that the prediction of the Martian astronomers was far more likely to be fulfilled than contradicted by the event. Yet so great was the happiness they found in this strange fulfilment of the faint hopes of years of almost hopeless waiting that, even as they journeyed on through the night with this threatening sign of approaching ruin pouring its angry light out of the skies, their talk was still rather of love and life and hope than of death and desolation, which they knew to be overhanging their race with such remorseless certainty. They had lived and loved, and their love had found fruition. What more could they have asked of fate than this, even if they could have prolonged their lives indefinitely by a mere effort of will? As Alan had said to Alma at the moment of their re-betrothal in the palm grove, they were immortal now, and for them the death of a world was but an accident on the onward progress of an evolution in which such souls as theirs, veritable sparks of the divine fire itself, were the dominating factors. As the fire cloud paled in the west, and the eastern heavens brightened with the foreglow of the coming dawn, the captains of the two vessels were roused by the signals from the conning towers, which told them that Alexandria was in sight. As soon as he got on deck, Alan signalled to the Isma to come close alongside. As she did so, and the morning greetings were exchanged, Alma appeared on deck, and suggested that Alexis and Isma should come and have breakfast on board the flagship, so that the two captains could discuss their final plans before descending to the city. The invitation was of course accepted, and an hour later the Alma commenced her descent towards the Sultan's palace, above which, from a lofty flagstaff, the banner of Islam was floating lazily in the early morning breeze. She flew no other ensign save a broad white flag of truce that streamed out from the signal mast at her stern. The whole city seemed asleep, secure in the conquest that had already been won. A single airship floated 2,000 feet above the palace, and as he approached her, Alan, keeping her well under his guns, flew from his mainmast the signal, "We come in peace. Will you respect the flag?" The Muslim captain saw at a glance that a single shell would annihilate his vessel, and that the Alma was perfectly protected by her consort, circling 2,000 feet above him. So he signalled, "Yes, come alongside." The Alma descended and swung round until she came on a level with the Muslim vessel. Then she ran alongside within speaking distance. The doors of the deck chambers were opened, and Alan, after exchanging salutes, asked the captain whether the Sultan was in his capital.
"Yes," replied the Muslim. "He is down yonder in his palace awaiting the coming of the Rina, for they are to join hands today and reign lord and mistress of the world they have conquered."
"Is the world then conquered?" asked Alan, with a smile on his lip and a note of scornful pity in his voice.
"Yes," said the Muslim. "East and west, north and south, the world is ours, saving only your own little land, and for that I suppose you have come to make terms of peace."
"I have not come to make terms of peace for Area, but for the world," replied Alan gravely. "But of this I must speak with your master. When will he be able to give me an audience?"
"That I cannot say," was the reply, "or even that he will hear you at all. But pardon, I did not know that the angels of paradise accompanied the Aryans on their voyages. Descend in peace. My master will receive you."
As he was speaking, Alma, crowned with her crystal wings and radiant with a beauty which to the Muslim's eyes seemed something superhuman, had come from the after part of the vessel to Alan's side. It was the first time that he had ever seen a woman of Area, and with the innate chivalry of his race he paid his involuntary homage to her as he would have done to an incarnation of one of the poetic dreams of his faith. Then salutes were exchanged again between the two captains, and the Alma sank swiftly downwards until she hovered 20 feet above the terrace on which Alma had first spoken with the Sultan on the night that he captured the Vindaya. The approach of the Aryan warship had already summoned a party of guards to the roof, and after a brief parley a message was carried to the Sultan from Alan. A few minutes later Khalid stepped out of the doorway leading from the interior of the palace, magnificently attired as though for some great ceremonial. He looked up and saw Alan standing with Alma by his side on the after deck of his ship. He saw too that the flag of truce was flying from the stern, and that the guns were laid alongside instead of being pointed down upon the city. He raised his hand in salute and said, "I see you are come in the guise of peace. If that is so, you are welcome." "It is peace, if your Majesty will have it so," replied Alan, returning his salute and at the same time making a sign for the Alma to descend to the roof of the palace. As her keels touched the floor of the terrace, the steps fell from the after doorway, and he came down, leaving Alma standing on deck by the open door.
"Will not your companion honour my palace by touching its roof with her foot?"
said Khalid, looking up at Alma as he exchanged greetings with Alan. "My companion, Sultan, is the wife of a man whom you turned your back upon on this very spot as a liar, a traitor, and a murderer," said Alan, looking him straight in the eyes. "How then could she honour your palace by setting foot on its roof?" For a moment the Sultan was abashed into silence by the directness of the rebuke, and then his oriental subtlety and quickness of thought came to his aid, and bending his head with royal dignity he said, "The angels do not mate with such men as that. The Tsarina must have been misled by appearance, perhaps indeed carried away by her hereditary hatred of your people. It is impossible that any but a true man could have won the love of such a woman. You tell me that you came as friends and not as enemies, so for the hour let there be peace, not war, between us. While you are my guest, my city is yours, and all that it contains. I pledge my honour for your safety, so let the daughter of the air descend, that I may hear from her lips the music of her voice." Turning aside, half to hide a smile at the oriental metaphor of the Sultan's speech, Alan went to the foot of the steps and held out his hand to Alma. As she alighted on the terrace, he led her towards him, saying, "This is my wife. Yesterday morning she was Alma Tremaine, a daughter of the 5th generation of the first president of the Federation. Her ancestors and yours made terms of peace after the War of the Terror. It is therefore more fitting that you should hear from her lips than from mine the message that we bring?"
"My ears are waiting," said Caled, bending low over the hand that Alma held out to him as Alan spoke. "It would be a strange message that would not be welcome from such lips."
From one whom she could have looked upon as an equal, such language as this would have jarred sorely upon Alma, accustomed as she was to the frank directness of her own people's speech. But from Caled she tolerated it as she would have tolerated the extravagance of a child, and as he raised his head again, she looked at him with eyes that dazzled him afresh. Intoxicated as he already was with her, to him, strange and almost unearthly beauty, and said in a voice such as he had never heard before,
"Thank you, Sultan, for your welcome. But surely there is little need for me to tell you what message we bring. Last night you saw it written in letters of fire across the heavens. Has not the voice of God spoken, bidding you and your people to cease the cruel warfare that you are waging upon the world, and to prepare for the end, of which that is a sign?"
As she spoke, she raised her hand and pointed to where the shape of the fire cloud now hung in the sky, like a white mist paling before the light of the rising sun.
"You rejected our first warning, as perhaps was natural, but now that you have seen the confirmation of it shining among the stars, surely you will no longer reject it."
The last words were spoken in a gentle, pleading tone, which no man could have heard without being moved by them.
"Daughter of the air,"
replied the Sultan, following her hand with his eyes,
"I have seen, and in a measure I believe your message, though my interpretation of it may be other than yours. If the end of the world is at hand, the commander of the faithful will know how to meet it as a true believer should. It is not impossible that there may be peace between us yet in the last hours of earthly life, for I would not willingly make war on a people that has daughters such as you."
"Not for our sake, Sultan, but for the sake of all who have survived this terrible warfare of yours, we are come to plead with you for peace,"
said Alma.
"There is no time for hate and strife and bloodshed. There will be horrors enough upon earth before long, without any made by the fury of man. It is in your power to give peace to the world, and breathing space to meet its end. Why will you not give it?"
"You forget it is not I alone who can give peace," replied Caled. "If that were so—"
Before he could speak another word, a salvo of aerial artillery shook the air above the city. All looked up towards the northern sky whence the sound proceeded, and saw a squadron of 20 silver-hulled airships flying the Muslim and Russian flags, and escorting in 2 divisions a warship from whose flagstaff flew the imperial standard of Russia, and whose shining hull of azurine proclaimed her the lost Ethereal. Alan grasped the perilous situation in an instant, and was about to tell Alma to go back on board their own ship when the Sultan, divining his intentions, took a step forward and said,
"Do you think that the Caled cannot protect his guest, or that his ally will not respect the hospitality of his house? You are safe. If a hair of your head was harmed, the Tsarina and I would be enemies, and she would come to her death instead of her bridal. For that is what brings her here. There is truce between us for this day at least, and she shall not break it."
As he ceased speaking, the 20 airships opened out into a long line and remained suspended 500 feet above the palace, while the Revenge continued her downward flight and alighted at the farther end of the terrace from where they were standing. The after door of the deck chamber opened as she touched the marble pavement. The steps dropped down, and Olga descended, attired as usual in a plain robe of royal purple, over which hung a travelling mantle of pearl grey cloth, as fine and as soft as silk, and lined with the then almost priceless fur of the silver fox. Her head was uncovered save for a plain golden fillet, from which rose a pair of slender silver wings, so thickly encrusted with diamonds that they seemed entirely fashioned of the flashing gems. The golden fillet shone out brightly yellow against the lustrous black of her thickly coiled hair, and the diamond wings blazed and scintillated in the sunlight with every movement of her head. As she descended the steps, she was followed by Orloff Lusensky and a guard of honour of 12 of her officers, splendidly dressed and armed to the teeth, who as soon as they landed drew their swords, which were now only used as ornamental insignia of rank, and ranged themselves in 2 lines, one on either side of her. Before the Revenge had alighted, the Sultan had made a sign to one of the sentries, who blew a long, clear blast on a silver bugle, which was instantly answered by 100 others from various parts of the city. At the sound, the Moslem metropolis seemed to wake from sleep into universal activity. Thousands of soldiers in brilliant uniforms poured into the empty streets. The Muslim and Russian flags ran up to 1,000 flagstaffs. Squadron after squadron of aerial cruisers soared up from the earth and saluted with salvos of artillery, which shook the very firmament and brought Alexis down to within 3,000 feet of the palace roof, in the belief that Alan and Alma had fallen victims to some treachery, and that the time had come for him to avenge them by laying the city in ruins, as he had promised to do in such an event. A single glance through his field glasses showed him the true state of affairs. So he contented himself with keeping his crew at quarters, with every gun trained on a Russian or a Moslem airship, and ready to spread death and ruin far and wide, should any harm happen to the Alma or her crew. While this was taking place, the Sultan's bodyguard had filed out onto the terrace, resplendent with gorgeous uniforms and glittering weapons, and between the 2 long lines that they formed, Khalid advanced to meet his bride, leaving Alan and Alma interested and not unanxious spectators of the strange and unexpected scene. They met halfway down the double line, and as Olga held out the hand, over which Khalid bowed low as he raised it to his lips, she said, with a glance of undisguised hate towards Alan and Alma, and a mocking smile on her lips,
"Your Majesty's generosity is unbounded. I see that you have invited to our wedding feast the only enemies with whom we have yet to measure swords."
"They have not come as enemies, Tsarina," replied Khalid, as he raised his head and looked with but half-restrained ardour on the beauty that was so soon to be his. "Nor yet have they come at my invitation. Alan Arnold and his wife—"
"His what?"
interrupted Olga, her cheeks burning and her eyes flashing with a sudden blaze of uncontrollable anger. "His wife, Tsarina," replied Khalid, somewhat coldly. "The son of Natasha and Richard Arnold has mated with their daughter of Alan Tremaine, and they have come in the 5th generation to warn you, their daughter of the house Romanoff and me, the son of the line of Mohammed Rashad, to cease our warfare upon the nations and prepare for the universal end which they tell us is at hand." Khalid spoke, as Olga thought, half in jest and half in earnest, so she continued in the same mocking tone in which he had first spoken.
"Then, if that is so, if all human enmities are soon to be purged by the all-destroying fire, we may as well meet in peace for the moment. Will your Majesty honour me by presenting me to your uninvited guests?"
"Uninvited, but still my guests, Tsarina," replied Khalid gravely, "and therefore I need not ask you—"
"No, Sultan,"
said Olga, interrupting him.
"You need ask me nothing. You need not fear that I should not respect the hospitality of your house, even when extended to them."
As she spoke, she gave him her hand again, and he led her between the silent, rigid ranks of his guards to where Alan and Alma were standing. Since men and women had learned to love and hate, there had been no such strange meeting between 2 women as that which now took place between Alma and Olga.
It was the first time that Olga had ever seen a woman of the race to which Alan belonged, and Alma, for the first time confronted with a daughter of the earth folk, saw in Olga Romanoff at once the most beautiful woman outside the confines of area, and the incarnations of everything she had been trained to look upon as evil. While the Sultan was speaking the words of presentation, their eyes met, and Alma thought of that sentence in Alan's letter to his father.
"She is as beautiful as an angel and as merciless as a fiend."
While Olga looked back to the time when she first heard Alma's name and hated her for the sake of him who now stood beside her, her lover and her husband, the man she had held in bondage for years without winning one voluntary caress from him. Alma's first emotion was one of wonder. Hitherto she had seen nothing beautiful that was not at the same time good, for in area the conceptions of beauty and goodness were inseparable. But here was a woman of almost perfect physical loveliness, after her own type, who was beyond all doubt guilty of the most colossal crimes that a human soul had conceived or a human hand had carried out since men first learned to sin. The world, which 10 years before had been a paradise of peace, prosperity, and enlightened progress, was now a wilderness of misery and an inferno of strife, fast lapsing back into barbarism, and all this was her doing. As this thought came to Alma's mind, standing out distinct among all the others that were forcing themselves upon her, wonder gave place to unspeakable horror, and as Olga approached, with the light of hate still burning in her eyes and the same mocking smile upon her lips, she instinctively shrank back as though to avoid contact with some unclean thing. As she did so, her hand slipped through Alan's arm, and a visible shudder ran through her form. Marvellous as Olga's power of self-control and dissimulation was, she failed entirely to restrain the passion which such a reception aroused within her. It was the first time in her life that she had ever stood in the presence of a woman untainted by a spot of sin or shame, and this woman recoiled from her in visible loathing. Beautiful and mighty as she was, at the very zenith of her conquering career, and on the morning of her promised union with the man who, as she believed, would before many days share the empire of the world with her. Hardened as she was, the mute rebuke cut her to the quick. The flush on her cheeks died out and left her so pale for the moment that her face looked almost ghastly, with its grey lips and black burning eyes. This daughter of a higher race had, at a single glance, pierced the splendid mask which covered the fearful deformity of her true nature. She thought of the night long ago in the bedroom at St. Petersburg, when by the light of the unearthly flame hovering above her poison still, she had seen her image in the mirror. Then pride and anger came to her rescue. The blood returned to her cheeks and lips. She drew herself up to the full height of her queenly stature, and as the Sultan spoke the words of presentation, she slightly inclined her head, and then raising it again said, in low, even tones, whose wonderful music sent a chill to Alma's heart,
"This is a pleasant surprise, Alan Arnold. I little thought that after our last parting we should meet again, safe in battle. Much less did I think that you would honour my bridal by bringing your own bride to it. Still, as the Sultan tells me, there is truce for today, and so far as to my enemy, you are welcome."
"We have not come as guests to your bridal, Serena," said Alan coldly and gravely, "nor have we come to make truce as between mortal enemies. The enmities of men and nations are but as child's play now. We have come to proclaim the truce of God against the hour of his final judgment." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Olga Romanoff by George Griffith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Shadow of Death.
Ah, I see,
said Olga.
You have come to tell us this wonderful story about the comet and the message you say you have received from Mars over again. You are not the first who have prophesied the end of the world by such means, nor will you be the last to be discredited by the event. Once and for all then, let me save misunderstanding by telling you that I don't believe a word of it, and therefore nothing that you can say will have any effect on the course of action that I have determined upon. You are of course at liberty to preach your truce elsewhere, and at your own risk, though I fear it will be but the voice of one crying in the wilderness.
Yes, truly in the wilderness, said Alma before Alan could reply, but a wilderness that you have made with your own hands, Syren. You, who have been the evil genius of the world. Have you not done harm enough, now that the world has only a few more weeks to live? According to the idle tale you bring us, interrupted Olga, repressing with a barely successful effort the anger aroused afresh within her by the serene tone in which Alma spoke. It sounded rather like the voice of an angel speaking to a mortal than of one woman addressing another, and even to herself Olga was forced to admit that there could be no question of equality between this daughter of the air and herself.
It is no idle tale,
replied Alma, almost in the same tone which she might have used in reproving a wayward child.
It is not even a prophecy. It is a mathematical certainty, and if you understood, you would believe. You are wasting your time and your own breath,
said Olga scornfully.
You are not my guest, but the Sultan's, yet he may allow me to say that we have other demands upon our attention, more important than listening to such sentimentalism as this.
Before Alma could answer, Alan turned to the Sultan as though not deigning to reply to Olga's insulting speech. Your Majesty, I see that this is no time to perform the mission upon which I came. We did not expect the presence of the Syren here. Had we done so, we should not have come, for I know how vain it would be to reason with her. I came prepared to satisfy the most skilful astronomers in your kingdom that what I say is absolutely true, and I ventured to hope that you, if satisfied by their assurances, would give peace to the world for the remnants of its days. But even so, it is not for us to interrupt or even to introduce an unpleasant element into the doings of today. So with your Majesty's permission, I will leave the calculations with your minister, and relieve you and the Tsarina of our unwelcome presence. All this time, the Grand Vizier Musa al-Ghazi had been standing a little to the rear of the group, shaking his beard nervously and looking anxiously from one to the other. He seemed about to speak, when Khalid said to Alan with a courtesy which contrasted strongly with Olga's contemptuous demeanour, I thank you, Prince of the Air. As matters stand, I think that will be the most reasonable as well as the most convenient course, though I am far from convinced that you are not mistaken. Yet I can assure you that the bare skill in my domains shall examine what you leave us. Musa. The old man turned pale as his master pronounced his name, and stepped forward with a visible agitation, which was by no means accounted for by the circumstances of the strange situation. Instead of waiting for Khalid's commands, he said as he made his obeisance before him, Commander of the Faithful, I am here, but before your Majesty bids me take these papers from the hands of Alan Arnold, I would ask permission to say a word that must be said in private. In private, Musa? Said Khalid, frowning slightly and passing his hand down his beard. This is hardly a time for state secrets. It is but my duty to my master that bids me to speak, replied the old man, again bending before him. A moment will suffice for the speaking of what I have to say. Musa's tone was so earnest and his anxiety so palpable that Kaled without more ado made his excuses to the Tsarina and his unexpected guests and stepped aside, out of earshot, with his vizier.
"Well, Musa, what is it that is so pressing and yet so private?"
he asked, a trifle impatiently.
"My master,"
replied the old minister, in a voice that now trembled with emotion,
"there is no need to examine the calculations from area. An hour before daybreak, Hacham ben Amru, your chief astronomer at the observatory of Memphis, came to me and told me that he had completed his own calculations of the curve and period of the comet, and that, allowing for difference in longitude between our meridian and that of area, the prediction for Mars will be fulfilled beyond all doubt at midnight on the 23rd of September.
This was testimony which it was impossible for Kaled to question. Musa's sincerity was beyond all question, and Hakem ben Amru was the most renowned astronomer in the world outside area. Kaled recoiled a pace as though he had been struck, and said in a voice hoarse with sudden emotion,
"Why did you not tell me this before, Musa?" "Because I would not mar my master's happiness for this day at least,"
replied Musa.
"If it be true that the end of earthly things is at hand, a day is of but small account. To tell you would neither hasten nor delay the end. But Arnold's words forced me to speak, for I knew that Hacham would speak if I did not."
Kaled laid his hands upon the old man's shoulders and said gravely but kindly,
"It was well thought, Musa, and I thank you for your consideration. Evil as your news is, it is kismet, and the will of Allah must be done."
So saying, he turned away and walked with slow steps and downcast eyes to where Olga was standing, talking to Orloff Losensky, with her back turned in open contempt upon Alma and Alan. A single glance at his face told her that Musa had no pleasant tidings to impart.
"Your Majesty looks grave," she said. "Has Musa given you news of some disaster to our forces?"
"More than that, Tsarina," replied Kaled. "He has brought me confirmation that I cannot doubt of the truth of the message from area."
"What?"
exclaimed Alma, in a quick, passionate tone that all standing near could hear.
"The confirmation of that thrice-told tale with which these people are trying to impose on our fears. Surely your Majesty is jesting now."
"No, Tsarina, it is no subject for jesting, but only for earnest and solemn thought,"
answered Kaled seriously.
"I neither can nor will believe it,"
cried Olga passionately, her long restrained anger completely overcoming her prudence, and her whole soul rising in ungovernable revolt.
"Believe or not as you will, I will not. It cannot be possible. It is too monstrous for all credence. Why would one think the very fates themselves were fighting against us if that were true, and were bringing the world to an end just as we have conquered it for our own? For our own. As for these aliens,"
she continued, turning upon Alan and Alma and taking a couple of steps towards them,
"they have come here with this vile story to cover an attempt to make terms with us before it is too late. It is a trick to deceive you, but it shall not succeed in my presence. Do you not remember how, upon this very spot, little more than a year ago, I showed you this same Alan Arnold, who now comes preaching about his truce of God, as the shameless liar and traitor that he is?"
She had thrown off all disguise and all restraint now. Hatred was shining out of her eyes, and open scorn was upon her lips. She waved her hands with a contemptuous gesture towards them, and went on.
"If you have come to ask for terms of peace, Be honest and say so. You need not fear to speak, for there may be conditions on which we will let you live.
Caelid was about to utter some reproof, and Alan's hand had gone instinctively to the hilt of his rapier, when Alma stepped forward and faced Olga, her own eyes now burning dark with anger, and her cheeks flushed with the hot blood which Olga's insult had called to them.
"Make terms with you?"
she said, looking down upon her from the height of her splendid stature.
"With you, who have laid the earth waste, and made the habitations of men desolate? With you, whom I could strike dead at my feet, without staining my hand by laying it upon you? It is for you to make terms, if you can. Not with us, but with the heaven whose justice you have outraged, and whose patience you have scorned. Cease this idle talk of battle and conquest, this impious defiance of the decrees of fate. Can you make terms with God? If so, then when you see his sign blazing in the heavens tonight, cause it to change its path, and pass aside from the earth. If not, kneel down and pray, not for your life, for that would be useless, but for the strength to meet your end in the midst of the desolation that you have created."
Olga heard her in silence to the end, her whole being shaken with the tempest of passion that Alma's words set raging in her breast. For a moment she stood speechless, white to the lips and trembling in every limb from very rage. Then she suddenly stepped back a pace and cried in a voice more like the cry of a wild animal in pain than human speech.
"Whether the world lives or not, you shall not, whatever comes."
And as she spoke, she snatched a pistol out of her girdle and levelled it at Alma's heart. Before she could spring the lock, Alan had snatched Alma up in his arms, and Caelid, with a cry of horror and anger, had sprung forward and grasped Olga's wrist. The bullet flew high, cutting one of the wings off Alan's coronet in its flight. Half a dozen strides took him alongside his ship, and in another instant he was standing on her deck. His left arm round Alma's waist, holding her behind him, and his right hand grasping one of his pistols. He raised his arm, and the pistol flashed. At the same moment he stamped on the deck, and the Alma leapt 1,000 feet obliquely into the air. The second before the pistol flashed, Olga turned her head, as though she were going to fire again, and the motion saved her life. For Alan's bullet, instead of piercing her brain, as it was meant to do, cut a straight red gash across her forehead, from temple to temple, and buried itself in the breast of Orloff Lasensky, as he sprang forward to snatch his mistress out of the line of fire. He pitched forward and dropped, and Caelid, forgetting everything else in the horror of the moment, caught Olga in his arms as a rain of blood streamed down over her face, and a shrill scream of pain and rage burst from her lips. Although there were nearly 300 warships floating in the air above Alexandria, and though the rapidly enacted tragedy on the roof of the palace could be distinctly seen from their decks, the Alma escaped scatheless, for the simple reason that, so terrible was the energy developed by the projectiles in use, that had one struck her as she left the terrace, the palace itself would have been wrecked, and every living being within a radius of 200 yards from the focus of the explosion would have been instantly killed. Consequently, the captains of the Russian and Muslim ships had to look on in angry impotence as she leapt out of range, joined her consort, and with her soared away westward until a height of 15,000 feet was reached, and so vanished from the sight of their discomfited enemies. From Alexandria they crossed the Mediterranean and Europe to Britain by way of Italy, the valley of the Rhone and Paris. At a height of some 5,000 feet from the land, what they saw more than justified the reports which had reached Aeria. The fairest countries of Europe were now only blackened deserts and wasted wilderness. They flew all day over deserted fields and towns and cities.
that were little better than heaps of blackened ruins. And when night fell and the fire cloud blazed out of the sky, its glare was answered by flames rising from the earth, and huge patches of mingled smoke and flame which marked the sites of other towns which were only now falling victims to the destroyers. Society had practically come to an end. People who a few weeks before had been wealthy watched almost with apathy the plunder of their homes and the burning of their palaces by the armed bands of robbers which sprang up everywhere. There was no longer any protection for life and property. If anarchists on the earth did not burn and slay and plunder, their enemies in the air would. And even if they did not, what did it matter if friends and foes, plunderers and plundered, were to be consumed together in the fire that was about to fall from heaven? Amidst the universal terror, Alma, with her almost unearthly beauty, the calm dignity of her bearing, and the sweetness and gentleness of her loving counsels, passed through the devastating lands rather like an angel of mercy than a woman of the same flesh and blood as the distracted, panic-stricken crowds through which she moved by Alan's side, speaking her message in a voice that seemed to be an echo from some other world. When the Alma and the Isma reached London 10 days after leaving Alexandria, they found the vast and once splendid metropolis of the world a wide waste of broken, blackened, and in some places still smoking ruins. Of its 15 million of inhabitants, barely 3 million remained to people its fragments. All the rest had fled soon after the first assault, or had fallen in the pitiless carnage that had been let loose upon them. They remained 3 days amid the ruins of London, listening to the most heart-rending tales of suffering and cruelty, and giving in return such consolation as they could. Then they took the air again, and journeyed on westward over the once fair and smiling English land that was now a wilderness, amidst with plague and famine, anarchy and destruction stalked triumphant, while the few who listened to their message waited in despairing terror for the fate that could hardly be worse than what they had passed through since the fatal 16th of May. From England they crossed the Atlantic to America, and from America they sped over the Pacific to Australia, finding everywhere the same desolation upon the face of the earth, and the same terror and despair in the minds of men. But for the awful reality before their eyes, it would have been impossible for them to believe that the civilization which had seemed so strong and splendid 4 months before could have collapsed as it had done into such utter chaos. In those 4 short months, the whole tragedy of human life on earth seemed to have been reenacted. The frenzy and panic of war had degenerated into a universal delirium. Men, women, and children had gone mad by millions. Religious fanatics, impostors, and enthusiasts, if possible more insane than their hearers, preached the wildest and most blasphemous doctrines, and uttered the most hideous prophecies, not only as to the approaching end of the world, but of the imaginary eternal horrors that were to follow it. The art and science and culture of 500 years had been forgotten in those few weeks of madness, and mankind had sunk back wholesale into the grossest superstition of the Dark Ages. Every night, when the flaming shape of the fire cloud blazed out among the stars, millions fell down on their knees and greeted it with prayers and invocations, as savages had once been wont to worship their fetishes. By the end of August, when the fiery arc overarched more than 2/3 of the heavens and rivaled the sunlight itself in brightness, the degeneration of humanity had advanced to such a fearful stage of intellectual and moral depravity that even human sacrifices were offered to appease the wrath of the deity who was believed to have taken the shape of the fire cloud. Under the influence of delirium, the human mind had gone back through 25 centuries, and the worship of Baal and Moloch had returned upon earth. Only a small minority of men and women preserved their senses amidst the universal madness. These greeted the Aryans as friends, and heard their message and promised to remain steadfast to the end. But as day after day went by, and the terror grew and the nations plunged deeper and deeper into the saturnalia of frenzy and despair, the task undertaken by Alan and Alma grew more and more hopeless, and when the last day of August came, they at length confessed to themselves that it was useless to pursue it any further. This, too, was the day on which the term of absence granted by the council expired, and so at nightfall, after having carried their message round the whole world and passed it by the mouths of those who were willing to listen through many lands, they at length reluctantly turned their prows homeward, and, with hearts sickened by all the unspeakable horrors they had witnessed, soared upwards into the luridly lighted heavens, leaving the world to the fate which in 23 days more would overwhelm the conquerors and the conquered, the few sane and the many mad, in universal and inevitable destruction. Alan timed his arrival so that the Alma and her consort crossed the ridge a few minutes after sunrise on the 1st of September. As they alighted in the central square of the city and disembarked to greet the group of friends and kindred who were waiting to receive them, a strange stillness struck their ears and sent a mysterious chill to their hearts. The splendid capital of Area seemed like a city of the dead. Its broad white streets and squares were empty. There were no boats on the lake and no aerial yachts in the air as they were wont to be at sunrise. The gardens were deserted and silent. Even the songs of birds, which had welled up from them in a chorus of greeting to the coming sun, were now hushed, and the birds themselves were flying restlessly from branch to branch, twittering and calling to each other, frightened sharers in the universal fear. It was not long before Alan learnt from his father the explanation of this strange and mournful change in the life of the valley. A few days after their departure, a mysterious epidemic had appeared among the people of Area. First the old, then the middle-aged, and then the young had been silently and swiftly stricken down, first in hundreds, and then in thousands. There was no sign of physical disease, no apparent source of physical infection, and none of the horrors which characterized the plagues that were decimating the outside world. Those attacked by it went to bed in apparently robust health, and in the morning they were found dead, with an expression of perfect peace upon their features, and no marks of disease upon their bodies. That was all that was publicly known. There had been, and, as the President told his son, there would be no inquiry into the cause or origin of the epidemic. Whether those who died voluntarily, or whether the visitation was a merciful release from the torment and terror of the general doom, it was not for those who survived to ask. It was enough for them that the shadow of death had begun to steal silently and swiftly over the land of the royal race who had raised the dignity of humanity to a height untouched before in the story of man. They were content to know that their friends and kindred were permitted to die in painless peace, rather than forced to writhe out their last hours in torture amidst the conflagration of the world. All day and all night for nearly a month, the fires of 100 crematoria had burnt, and day and night the funeral processions had never ceased passing through their gates. The population of Area, which had been over 1 million at the end of July, was now little more than 100,000, and these were hourly dwindling under the mysterious epidemic. Those who had returned in the Alma and the Isma accepted all without question, and applied themselves with all their energy to the performance of the solemn duties that remained to them. The work in the caverns of Mount Austral was now almost completed, and the minute calculations which had been made had shown that it would be possible for 250 souls to find a refuge in them for 10 days if necessary. Sufficient supplies of food had been already stored, the machinery for lighting the caverns was complete, and the solid oxygen had been enclosed in steel reservoirs to supply what would be consumed by respiration, while provision had also been made for continually abstracting the carbonic acid and other injurious constituents from the respired air. Everything that human genius and skill at their best could do to ensure the preservation of this remnant of humanity had been done. And by the 15th of September, the caverns were finally ready for occupation. Only one more task now remained to be completed, and this was the selection of those who were to survive, provided that the precautions taken proved adequate. Unspeakably pathetic as this work of selection was, it was performed with a calm and apparently passionless precision worthy of the unparalleled solemnity of the occasion and the splendid traditions of those who accomplished it. The field of selection was first narrowed by confining it to those who had been regularly betrothed when the first message was received from Mars. From these first the physically perfect were chosen, then the strongest and the fairest of these, and finally those who to their physical perfection added the highest intellectual and moral qualities. The work was performed by the ruling council, assisted by a council of an equal number of matrons, who had what had once been accounted the misfortune to be childless. Neither joy nor sorrow was shown, at least in public, either by those who were chosen or by those upon whom the joint council was forced to pronounce sentence of death by rejecting them. The natural joy of the chosen was lost in the universal sorrow of the now inevitable parting, and those who were destined not to survive, satisfied with the perfect justice with which the selection had been made, consoled each other with the knowledge that they would die hand in hand and be spared the sorrow of surviving all who were nearest and dearest to them. On the morning of the 18th, the Temple of Aeria witnessed the last ceremony that would ever take place within its walls. This was the marriage of those who, unless their last refuge shared in the destruction that was about to bring chaos upon the earth, were to be the parents of the new race that was to repeople the world. The survivors of the whole nation now barely filled the vast interior of the temple. The solemn words which bound youth and maid together as man and wife to face side by side the last ordeal that humanity would ever have to pass through were spoken in the midst of a silence which reigned not only in the temple, but now throughout the whole valley. All the sentinel ships had now been withdrawn save one, which from a height of 15,000 feet still kept watch and ward against the coming of the foe that was even yet expected. But this was the only sign of life within the confines of Aeria. And when the solemn ceremony was ended and the assembly filed out of the doors, the members of it betook themselves almost in silence to their homes, there to make their final preparations for life or death, as destiny had selected them to live or die. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Olga Romanoff by George Griffith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Last Battle. At sunset on the 15th, the sluice door had been finally lowered into its place, and the pent-up waters of the lake of Aeria had risen nearly 40 feet by the next morning. Only the upper parts of the villas on its banks were visible, and its area was so enormously increased that the whole appearance of the valley was altered. Rising at first at the rate of 3 feet an hour, a rate which of course decreased as the area became greater, the waters would reach the entrance to the caverns soon after sunset on the evening of the fatal 23rd. A little before midnight on the 21st, the Orion, the sentinel ship that was on guard at the time, sank swiftly down with the news that she had made out by the light of the fire cloud which, lurid and ghastly as it was as brilliant and penetrating as that of the sun at noonday, a large fleet of airships approaching from the northwards. The city was by this time almost entirely submerged. Only a few minarets and towers, and the top of the great golden dome of the temple, surmounted by its crystal-winged figure, showed above the surface. The remnant of the people of Aeria, now reduced to less than 7,000 souls, including those chosen to take refuge in the caverns, were occupying the villas on the slopes of Mount Austral, above the entrance to the caverns. 6,000 of them were men who had lived solely in the hope of such an attack as was now about to be made, and which would enable them to die fighting, the common enemy of mankind, to the last in defence of their beloved native land. Not even now, when the hand of destiny had set a definite limit to all human hopes and fears, and when the remainder of their own lives could be counted by hours, could this faithful remnant of the Aryans endure the thought that what had been their paradise and their home should be violated and polluted by the appearance of their foes. Therefore they had lived for this last battle, and 500 airships were waiting to carry them into the air to engage in the last fight that ever would be fought on earth. All their friends and kindred, saving only the children of deliverance, as in fond fancy they had called the little band of the chosen ones, were now dead, and the few hours of life that were left to them had nothing more to give them. So they received with a grim joy the summons to battle which had been so long expected. 4,000 of them manned the airships. The rest occupied the mountain batteries, and within a quarter of an hour of the bringing of the news the warships had mounted into the air, and the great guns of the batteries were ready to haul their projectiles upon the advancing foe. It was a spectacle to make angels weep and devils laugh. This last marshalling of the forces of human hate and hostility in the closing hours of the life of humanity and on the threshold of eternity. It seemed that the tragedy of man was to be played out to the bitter end, and that human strife was only to cease on earth with the destruction of the world. This, too, was the work of a single woman, inspired by quenchless hatred, an insatiable ambition, and a pride of spirit which, in its haughty incredulity, still refused to believe that the end of her conquering career had come. Pitiless, and without scruple to the end, Olga, while she was recovering from her wound under the shelter of the Sultan's roof, had managed, with the aid of her waiting woman Anna, not only to poison the Grand Vizier Musa and Hakam the astronomer, but also to bring Khalid himself into the same state of moral slavery in which he had so long held Alan and Alexis. It was she who had brought this fleet from Alexandria to Aeria. Once under the fatal spell of her will poison, she had commanded Khalid to revoke the orders that he had given for peace, and he had obeyed. A fleet of more than 500 airships had been collected, and, taking Khalid with her on board the Revenge, so that there should be no chance of his recovering his volition, she had come to fulfill the prophecy which Paul Romanoff uttered when in the last hours of his life he had declared that one day the eagle of Russia should fly over the battlements of Aeria. All the materials for constructing 10 airships had been taken into the caverns, so that in the event of the remnants surviving, the empire of the air should still be theirs. But the Alma and the Isma still lay outside the entrance when the other ships had risen into the air. At the supreme moment, a controversy had arisen as to whether or not Alan and Alexis, the latter of whom had been placed without question among the chosen, not only because of his unequalled engineering skill, but also because without him, a daughter of the House of Arnold would have died of her own will, should or should not take part with their companions in the near approaching conflict. This dispute was brought to a sudden close by Alan, who with a single inspiration cut short all the loving entreaties that were being made to him to take refuge in the caverns and avoid the chance which in the heat of the conflict might destroy with him the male line of the descendants of the first conqueror of the air.
"Do you not see," he said, "that it is quite possible that their fleet may be twice as strong as ours, and that in spite of all our gallant Florenhoe can do, they may cross the mountains and send their shells into the valley? What if one of them exploded here, and wrecked the outworks and the entrance to the caverns. All hope, even for us, would then be lost. The doors could not be lowered, and we should either have to let the waters of the lake flow out, or they would flow into the cavern by the upper entrance and ruin all our labours. We have proved that the Alma and the Isma are the two best airships in existence. They can soar higher and travel faster than any others. Would it not be madness to deprive our defending force of them? And would it not be cowardice in us not to do all we can to save all that is left for us to hope for on earth? I, for one, shall go, and I don't believe that I shall go alone. If the Alma goes, the Isma goes too, said Alexis. Alan is right. We should be cowards to turn our backs on the enemies at this last moment. And if you go, we go, said Alma and Isma in a breath. If you live, we will live with you, but we will not live without you. There was no answer to such reasoning as this, nor was there any longer any law on earth save that of individual will. The first motive power that had swayed the world was the last that survived and would be the last to die. Those of the old crews of the two airships who were found among the chosen at once came forward to take their places, and with them came too those who had elected to take the hazard of life or death with them. There shall be no widows in the new world, said they, and so every man who rose into the air on board the two great warships carried with him the woman without whom the one last chance of life would not have been worth taking. As they left the earth, the remainder of the little company retired into the caverns, leaving two sentinels posted at the outer door ready to give the alarm in case it should be necessary to lower the doors. As they did so, a long, dull, distant roar came from the northward, telling that the last battle of man with man had begun. In accordance with the plan hastily arranged before they rose, the Alma was to guard the northern end of the valley, while the Isma kept watch over the southern. They soared up and up until the peaks of the mountains were a good 5,000 feet below them. From this elevation, those on board the Alma could see the enemy's fleet stretched out in a huge crescent, made up of tiny points of light which shone in the unnatural glare that illumined the earth and sky. And ever and anon they saw enormous spheres of flame blaze out along the line as the projectiles from the land batteries burst in front of them. The gunners were only trying their range, and the enemy was still behind it. The explosion of the projectiles told the assailants that area was on the alert, still prepared for battle and still, for all they knew, as impregnable as ever. Seeing this, they ceased their advance, and a battle of tactics preceded the pitiless struggle which only the victors would survive. Hour after hour, the Muslim and Russian airships strove to outsoar the Aryans, or to make a rush in twos and threes that would bring them within range of the charmed circle of the mountains. But no sooner did one of them sweep up at full speed out of the distance and slow down sufficiently to train her guns than the atmosphere about her was convulsed with a mighty shock, and changed instantly into a mist of fire. And when this vanished, she had vanished too, shattered to fragments which dropped in a rain of molten metal thousands of feet to the earth below. Morning came. The flaming arch of the fire circle sank lower and lower in the heavens until it stretched a broad band of lurid light round the western horizon, and an unclouded sun brought the last dawn but one that the terror-maddened myriads of earth would ever see. Still, the fight went on at long ranges. Still, ship after ship of the hostile fleet made its desperate efforts to cross the invisible barrier which was drawn all round area by the range of its protecting guns, only to be overturned and hurled to the earth by the shock of an exploding projectile, or to be fairly struck and dissolved to dust. No matter how high they attempted to soar, the Alma and the Isma were still above them, and if the shells from the land batteries failed to do their work, the guns of the airship did it for them, and the results were the same: annihilation. The night of the 22nd was spent in incessant attack and defence. The crews of the Aryan ships
grown desperate in their supreme despair, now left the mountains and sallied forth into the open, engaging the enemy ship for ship and gun for gun, in a last determined effort to destroy them, or be destroyed. And far out from the still untouched battlements of Aeria, the fight raged fast and furious. There now was no thought of safety in the hearts of the Arians. They had come forth to kill and be killed. The rules of aerial tactics were utterly neglected. They laid their guns alongside and, rushing through the air at their utmost speed, they hurled themselves with the ram upon every Muslim or Russian vessel that they could meet or overtake, crashing into her with irresistible force and going with her into annihilation as their 2 cargoes of shells exploded under the shock. The last sun rose and saw the fight still going on. What had begun as the greatest battle in the history of war had now dwindled down to a series of single combats. At length the end came. It was a few minutes after midday that the last blow in the battle was struck. 10 Russian and Muslim airships, all that remained of the great fleet that Olga had brought against Aeria, formed in line 10 miles from the ridge, and made a last attempt to break through the defences. Flying through a storm of shells from the land batteries, 7 of them were torn to pieces, and the other 3, just as they reached the ridge, were met obliquely by the 5 remaining vessels of the Aerian fleet. The same moment, the Alma's broadside was discharged upon them. Friend and foe vanished together in a mist of flame. And so ended the assault and defence of Aeria. "We can go now," said Alan in a broken voice to Alma, who was standing white and speechless with horror at his side in the bows of the airship. "It is all over. God rest their gallant souls, for they left the world like brave men and true Arians." "Amen," sighed Alma. Then after a brief pause she said, "I wonder whether Olga Romanoff is alive or dead." The 2 airships now sank together and alighted close to the entrance to the caverns. There, the splendid fabrics were reluctantly abandoned. Their crews disembarked, taking with them everything they wished to preserve, and a minute inspection was made for the last time of the triple doors and the machinery for lowering them, and filling the spaces between them with water to be frozen as soon as they were in their places. This occupied the time until the evening, and then all went once more into the open air to take what might be their last look at the sun. The waters of the lake were now within a few feet of the entrance, creeping more and more slowly upwards, and across the vast expanse of water, lying unruffled by the lightest breeze, fell the mingled rays of the sinking sun and the brightening fire cloud. There was not a cloud in the heaven, and no breath of wind relieved the almost suffocating heat of the inert and sultry air. It seemed as though all terrestrial nature lay paralysed in a stupor of terror, waiting for the fire blast that would wither it into death and ruin. As the sun sank down behind the veil of flame, his disk loomed redly and dully through it. Long streams of fire, blue and green and orange, darted across the disk and leapt and played round its circumference until it sank finally out of sight. The little group on the shore of the lake gazed at each other in silence as it disappeared. Their faces looked wan and ghastly in the awful light that now reigned supreme in the heavens. Most of them turned away in grief and horror too deep for words, and with one last look at earth and sky crept into the caverns, unable any longer to support the terror of the scene. But a few remained, determined to see the fearful drama played out to the end, if they could, and among these were Alan and Alexis, whose duty kept them by the doors, the President and Francis Tremaine, and Alma and Isma, whom nothing could persuade to leave their husbands' sides. No human eyes had ever beheld so magnificent or so awful a display of celestial splendours as they beheld during the 3 hours that they stood in the doorway after sunset. The fire cloud now covered almost the whole heavens, and its enormous nucleus blazed like a gigantic sun down out of the zenith with a heat and radiance that were almost insupportable. Huge masses of flame leapt out continuously, as though hurled from its fiery heart, and were projected far beyond its circumference, while the incandescent cloud mass which surrounded it was torn and convulsed by internal commotions which spread out and out in enormous waves of many-coloured fires until they disappeared below the horizon. Still, there was neither sound nor breath of wind upon earth, only the awful stillness in which the world waited for the hour of its doom to strike. At last, towards 10 o'clock, the water began to lap the threshold of the entrance, and Alan, pointing to it, said, "Come, we must take our last look at the world. It is time to lower the doors." The words were scarcely out of his mouth before a low, dull, booming sound came echoing down the gorges of Mount Austral. They looked up and saw huge masses of snow and ice loosened from its upper heights, gliding, at first slowly, and then more and more swiftly, down towards the valley beneath. A mighty avalanche which in a few minutes more would carry irresistible ruin in its path. "In with you all!" cried Alan. "Quick! This is the beginning of the end. The snows are melting, and the waters will be over us in another hour." All but he and Alexis hurried in, and they, grasping the levers on either side of the door, pulled them, and the enormous sheet of steel descended quickly along its grooves and shut them in from the outer world, upon which chaos was about to fall. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Olga Romanoff by George Griffith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The She-Wolf to her lair. In the mysterious revolution of human things, it came about that the only spectator of the closing scene of the tragedy of humanity, who endured and survived its final terrors, was the woman to whom it had been due that the fire from heaven had fallen upon a world mad with the frenzy and agony of war, instead of sane and calm with the sanity and calmness of peace and reason. On the issue of the Battle of Area, Olga and, under her unnaturally acquired influence, the Sultan, had staked the empire of the world and lost it. Before the fight had been raging many hours, even she was forced to admit that Area was impregnable to any assault that she could deliver. But when the Aryans began to practice the desperate tactics of the second day, it became manifest that nothing but annihilation awaited the invading fleet, outmatched as it was in speed and gunpowder by the new Aryan warships and the land batteries. With eyes burning with rage and envy, she had watched through her glasses the incomparable Alma floating serenely at her unattainable altitude far above the battle storm. And she had pictured Alan, her former slave, standing upon her deck, perhaps bitterest thought of all, with his wedded love beside him, and like a very arbiter of war, hurling his destroying lightnings far and wide upon her ships until the supreme moment came in which he would descend like a very god from the upper air, and, hand in hand with Alma, strike the last terrible blow which would end the last conflict of man with man, and leave neither friend nor foe alive to tell what the issue had been. It would be a glorious end, worthy of him and the splendid traditions of his race, and she loathed herself for the craven fear that had seized upon her in the fateful hour of battle, and made her incapable of challenging the same fate at his hands. Kaled himself would have done so without hesitation, but she had robbed him of his manhood and debased him as she had debased every other human being that had fallen under her influence. She had spent nearly the whole of the night of the 22nd on deck, and when the awful radiance of the fire cloud was for the last time succeeded by the light of day, even her haughty spirit had at last bowed before the supernatural terrors that were multiplying about her. For the first time since she had brought bloodshed back into the world, a thrill of panic shuddered through her soul, and for the first time she learnt the meaning of fear. Then, too, came a longing which for the time being overmastered all other considerations. The elementary animal instinct of self-preservation rose up within her with irresistible force, and conquered the hate and the ambition whose objects would have vanished when another sun had risen. Her thoughts went back to her old stronghold in the snowy solitudes of Antarctica, to the deep dark caverns of Mount Terror. Surely those mighty walls of living rock, shrouded in eternal ice and snow, would give her an asylum in which she could defy the fate that was about to overwhelm humanity. And what then? For a moment, an awful vision of the unspeakable loneliness of such a survival amidst the ruins of the world struck such terror to her heart that she almost resolved to head the Revenge into the thick of the fight that was still raging round Area and die rather than face it. Then the vision passed, and the terrors of the present blotted out the fear of the future. The last sun that the human race would ever see was just rising when she sent for Boris Lesensky, who was still commanding the Revenger under her, and said abruptly, and without even consulting Kaled, who was standing by her side,
"There is nothing but death to be found here. We will escape if we can. Head the ship for Mount Terror, and make her fly as she has never flown before. Don't spare either the engines or the power. We must be there before nightfall, if possible."
Boris saluted and obeyed in silence, and Olga turned to Kaled and said in a tone of weariness and almost of despair,
"It is no use fighting any longer. The fates themselves are against us, and yes, I have been frightened into belief at last. A shameful confession, is it not?"
"Not shameful, but only reasonable," he replied. "All I regret is that you did not believe sooner, and save this last slaughter of these gallant people."
"What is done,"
she said, with a half-regretful glance at the mountains of Area, which were now rapidly fading away into the blue distance.
"It is only a question of sooner instead of later. Indeed, it seems hardly worth while even for us to attempt to live when, even if we survive, only the ruins of the world can be ours, and yet—"
"Yet sweeter would be life with you, even in a wilderness of death, than destruction that might be eternal parting," replied Kaled in low tones that thrilled with passion. "Nay, what dearer destiny could man desire than to be the Adam of a new world of which you were the Eve?" The words of her husband, for Kaled was her husband now as well as her slave, brought a sudden flush to Olga's face, and this was succeeded by an almost deathly pallor. She put up her hand to the broadened circlet of gold which concealed the terrible scar of the wound made by Alan's bullet, and said almost in a whisper, "You and I, yes, you and I may live. We will. But if we do, we must save ourselves alone." And with that she left him abruptly and went to her own room, with the plan of her last crime already shaped in her mind. She was the only woman on board the Revenge. Her maid Anna had been left behind at Alexandria, a maniac driven mad by the universal terror. What of Boris and the 25 men who formed the airship's crew? If they were permitted to survive to the time when there would be no law but might, she would be the one woman in the world, one woman, beautiful and almost defenceless, among those who, though now her servants, would then be ready to slay each other in the dispute as to which of them should be her master. Such a thought in such a mind as hers could have but one outcome. When the hour for the midday meal arrived, she bade Boris invite the whole crew into the main saloon, saying that, as this might be the last meal that any of them would eat, they would take it together. Then, as though moved by some sudden gracious fancy, she filled for every man with her own hands a glass of the best and oldest wine that had been reserved for her own use. Khaled, rigid Muslim as he was, refused it, and she only touched it with her lips. But the others drained their glasses and drank death at her hands, even as the Aryans had drunk it in the same fashion and at the same table 7 years before. But this time it was fated that her sin should find her out more quickly. Later on in the afternoon, Boris, to his amazement and alarm, found every man of his crew succumbing to an irresistible drowsiness. And soon this began to affect himself. A terrible thought at once flashed into his ever-suspicious mind. Fighting against the stupor that was stealing over his senses, he took a deep draught of strong spirit. This conquered the poison for a time, and cleared his intellect sufficiently for him to see what his pitiless mistress had done. And then there rose up in his mind a desperate longing for vengeance on the murderess who had used him and his companions as long as they were useful, and then poisoned them like so many rats. He took out his pistol and examined it to see if it was charged, and then, with the poison and the spirit fighting in his brain for mastery, he made his way from the engine room to the quarterdeck, where Olga and Khaled were standing, watching with strained, fascinated eyes and faces that looked livid and corpse-like in the unnatural light of the fire cloud, the long tongues of many-coloured flame that were shooting like so many gigantic serpents down from the zenith, as though they would lick the lifeblood out of the world that now lay panting for breath and paralysed with fear beneath them. Just as he reached the top of the companionway, a mist swam before Boris's eyes. His brain reeled, and he stumbled forward onto the deck, discharging his pistol aimlessly as he did so. The bullet struck and broke to fragments against the bulwarks. Khaled and Olga turned round to see him lying on his side, with savagely gleaming eyes, livid face, and foam-flecked lips, trying to raise himself on one hand and take aim at them with the other. As Khaled sprang forward, Olga's ever-ready pistol came out of her belt. She cried to Khaled to get out of the line of fire. But just as she spoke, Boris made his last effort, and, taking what aim he could, pulled the trigger. Khaled stopped short and clasped his hand to his right side. Then Olga, with a low cry of fury breaking from her white lips through her clenched teeth, sent a bullet through Boris's brain, just as he was struggling to bring his pistol up again.
"Are you hurt, Khaled?"
she asked with a deadly fear at her heart, as she crossed the deck to where he was standing with his hand still pressed to his side.
"Yes,"
he gasped.
"He has shot me through the lung."
Then he coughed, and Olga saw drops of blood on his black beard and moustache. Without wasting any time in useless words, she helped him down into the saloon, and set herself at once to examine and dress his wound. The bullet had entered between the 4th and 5th ribs on the right side, drilling a clean hole through the lower lobe of the right lung, and passed out at the back without touching any bone. With perfect rest and quiet, there was nothing to prevent recovery from such a wound. But Olga shuddered as she thought of its consequences in their present situation. If Khaled succumbed, as he well might do under the unknown terrors and dangers of the night that was now so near, she would have to choose between killing herself beside him, or, if the rock chambers of Mount Terror proved a safe asylum, living mateless and alone until she starved to death on the wilderness that the world would be when it had passed through its baptism of fire. She satisfied Khaled's whispered request for an explanation of Boris's attempt on their lives by saying that he had probably made himself drunk in an attempt to fortify himself against the terrors that were multiplying around him. Then she went through the ship and in a few minutes came back and said,
"I shall have to take the ship to Mount Terror myself. It was not only Boris, for every man of the crew is dead drunk. Think of them making such brutes of themselves at such a time. No,
she continued, putting her hand on his shoulder as she saw him make an attempt to rise.
You must not move yet. You will want all your strength when we get there, for you will have to regulate the engines while I am in the conning tower. As for these animals, we will leave them to their fate.
A couple of hours later she went on deck to see whether Mount Terror, or at any rate the smoking crest of Mount Erebus, was in sight. For the Revenge had now been flying almost long enough to have reached the confines of Antarctica. The speed was, however, so great that nothing was distinctly visible. There was only the flaming heaven above them and a grey blur beneath, so she went to the engine room and slowed down to 100 miles an hour. Then she helped Caleb to the engineer's seat in front of the controlling levers and took her place in the conning tower. She had scarcely been at her post half an hour before she saw the huge white cones of the twin mountains of Antarctica shining against the dull grey skies beyond. One of them crowned as she had last seen it by a long stream of smoke that rose almost vertically in the windless air. She signalled to Caleb to reduce the speed, first to 50 and then to 30 miles an hour, allowing the Revenge at the same time to sink gently down towards the ice-covered continent. She crossed the well-remembered bay in which the Narwhal had performed her terrible exploit, swept over the ice wall at an elevation of 100 feet, swung the ship round and stopped her in front of the great cleft in the side of Mount Terror. No human foot seemed to have trodden the Antarctic solitude from the day she left it to crown herself Tsarina of the Russias to this one on which she brought her flagship back with its crew of murdered men to seek her last chance of life, amidst the general doom which she could now almost bring herself to believe she had directly brought upon the world. She ran the Revenge slowly into the vast portal that yawned black and deep before her, between the snow slopes of the mountain, and then, turning on the searchlight, took her along the great gallery which led to the shore of the subterranean lake, and then lowered her for the last time to the earth. Then she and Caleb disembarked. He moved slowly and painfully, and she supported him as well she was able, and watched him with the intense anxiety of a supreme selfishness which had now centred itself upon her as the one possibility of making her life endurable. Thus did Tsarina Olga and Caleb the Magnificent, conquerors of the earth and sharers of the world throne, come back, one wounded almost to death, and the other half distraught with fear and perplexity, to take refuge at the uttermost ends of the earth from the assault of the foe that had confounded all their schemes of conquest. Leaving the Revenge in the great gallery, she led him to the council chamber and laid him on the cushions of the luxurious divan on which she had been wont to hold her audiences. There she examined and redressed his wound, and then for the next 3 hours she busied herself bringing supplies of food and drink from the ship, and preparing for the final siege which their last stronghold would so soon have to endure. Then the fancy took her to go once more into the air, to take one more look at the world and the splendours of the fate that was menacing it. 19 hours had passed since she gave the order to head the Revenge for Mount Terror. 16 of these had been consumed in the most rapid flight that the airship had ever accomplished. So fast had the Revenge flown westward and southward that the sun had almost seemed to stand still, waiting for her journey to be accomplished. But still it had slowly sunk farther and farther down into the luminous mist that now seemed to fill the whole sky. The difference between the longitude of area and Mount Terror had lengthened the last fateful day by nearly 5 hours, but now the end was very near at hand, and here even, on the very confines of the world, life had little more than 4 hours to live. To the north,
The whole sky was flaming out into indescribable splendours, and the long fire streams radiating from the nucleus now seemed to be literally holding the planet in their clasp. Enormous meteors were bursting out from the heart of the flaming cloud and exploding without a sound in the ever-silent abysses of space. She stood rooted to the spot by the weird and awful glories of the spectacle, and for the time being seemed to forget even Caled and the indescribable dangers that were threatening them both. Instead of being daunted, her spirit rose as though in response to the splendours before her. She felt that she was standing upon nature's funeral pyre, watching the conflagration of the world she had ruined. Saving only Caled, there was not another human being within thousands of miles of her. And in her loneliness, her soul seemed to expand and rise to a nobility that it had never known before. She saw the utter insignificance and contemptibility of the human strife which had been superseded and silenced by this majestic assault of the primal forces of nature, and for the first time in her life she thought of herself and her sins with a disgust and shame that humbled her in her own eyes to the dust. So she stood and watched, oblivious of everything but the celestial glories above and around her, until a rapid series of frightful explosions seemed to run roaring round the whole horizon. She looked up with shaded eyes towards the zenith. The central mass had suddenly become convulsed and expanded until it looked as though the whole sky had been transformed into an ocean of fire torn by incessant storms. Huge masses of many-coloured flame were falling from it in all directions on the devoted earth, and as each of these entered the atmosphere, it burst into myriads of fragments, which fell in swarms until the blazing sky was literally raining fire over sea and land. The fire cloud had at last invaded the outer confines of the earth's atmosphere. All this while there had been no change in the Antarctic cold of the air. But soon after the first storm of explosions roared out, Olga felt a puff of warm, tainted air blow across her face. Then came another, and another, and then she heard what had never been heard before on the slopes of Mount Terror: the sound of running water. The snows were melting, and soon they would come avalanche and deluge. She hurried back into the council chamber, convinced that it was no longer safe to remain in the open air. She made the great bronze doors fast and covered them with layer after layer of thick, heavy curtains. Every other opening into the chamber she closed up as tightly as possible. In the nature of the case, they were compelled to trust to the supply of air already in it to last them through the ordeal. Then she went and sat down on the divan by Caled's side, and taking his hand in hers, bent over him and kissed him on the lips, saying, "Now we must wait for life or death together." And so they waited while the ages-old snow and ice melted from the bare black rocks under the fierce breath of the firestorm, while the oceans of flame seethed and roared and eddied about them, licking up the seas and melted snows, and fighting with them as fire and water have fought since the world began, while the foundations of the southern pole quivered and rocked beneath their feet, and the walls of their refuge quaked and cracked with the throes of the writhing earth, and cosmos was dissolved into chaos once more. End of chapter 32. Epilogue of Olga Romanoff by George Griffith. This recording is in the public domain. Vengeance is mine.
The temperature has been normal now for 3 hours. Don't you think we may venture to raise the sluice gates?
I see nothing against it. If the world is not habitable again now, it never will be. It is a good 2 days since the contact now, and if the atmosphere had been burnt up or carried away by the attraction of the comet, it would have either been much colder or much hotter than that.
Very well then, up it comes, and then we shall get our last question answered.
It was Alan who thus questioned and answered his father. All had gone well with the refugees of Mount Austral and the remnant of the Aryan race. Their science and their faith in themselves had been triumphantly justified by the event, and had carried them safely through the sternest ordeal that man had ever been called upon to face. And now there was only one more chance to be met, one more problem to be solved. The temperature showed that the Earth still possessed an atmosphere. But was that atmosphere capable of supporting human life? If yes, all would be well, and they could go forth into the wasted world and possess and replenish it. If no, then all their labour would have been in vain, and they might as well have died in battle or with those friends and kin who had taken their silent and dignified farewell of the world in the last days of the state of Area. They had a calorimeter and a pressure gauge communicating with the outer world to tell the temperature and the height of the water in the valley. The former, after rising for a few hours to over 1,000 degrees, had now sunk back to normal, while the latter stood at 30 feet above the entrance doors to the cavern. The machinery for raising the sluice gate was put into motion, and they watched it with almost breathless anxiety lest the straining or shifting of the rocks, which had been very perceptible during the terrific convulsions which had apparently lasted for nearly 10 hours, should have so dislocated the grooves that the gate could not be raised. There were a few preliminary creaks and groans, a hitch and an increased strain on the lifting chains, and then the great sheet of steel rose easily and smoothly to the top of the channel, and the pent-up waters rushed forth in a black boiling flood through the narrow opening and roared away, foaming and tossing along the bottom of the crevasse, once more on their way to their unknown destination. Very soon after this, it was discovered that the waters were subsiding much more rapidly than could be accounted for by the volume that escaped through the subterranean channel. It was therefore necessary to conclude that there must have been some convulsion in another part of the mountains which had opened a fresh channel from the lake to the outer world. The next step was to raise the two inner of the 3 doors which guarded the entrance to the caverns. The raising of the first one showed the ice still intact between it and the second, and this had to be broken up and removed before the second could be reached. Then the middle door was raised an inch or so, and the water spurted out from beneath it. Was this the water of the melted ice, or was it that which filled the valley? Had their outer door stood firm, or had it cracked or shriveled up under the heat of the furnace through which the earth had passed? It flowed for 10 minutes, and then slackened and stopped. The outer door had held fast. Then, in case of accidents, the middle one was lowered again, and they waited until the water should have sufficiently subsided to enable them to challenge the last hazard on which their fate depended. The sluice gate had been raised at what would be 4 o'clock on the morning of the 26th of September, if the cataclysm through which the earth had passed had not so far affected the terrestrial economy as to alter the relations of day and night. 12 hours later the pressure gauge ceased to act, showing that the rapidly sinking waters of the lake had reached the threshold of the outer door. The time had now come to ask the question on the answer to which the lives of the remnant of humanity depended. Was the atmosphere breathable or not? That was the one question which occupied, to the momentary exclusion of all others, the mind of every Aryan who was in the caverns. The middle gate was lifted, and every heart stood still as Alan and Alexis strode forward into the dark passage and grasped the levers which actuated the lifting mechanism of the outer one. They took one glance back at the anxious faces which showed so white in the gleam of the electric lamps, and then they pulled.
The machinery creaked and groaned as the power was applied. Then came a rending sound and a dull crash. The door lifted a little, quivered, and dropped again, and remained immovable.
"The machinery has broken down,"
said Alan, going back into the gallery.
"There must have been a landslip over the doorway." "What will you do then?"
said Alma.
"Surely we have not escaped the conflagrations of the world to be buried alive after all?"
"No," he said, looking down at her with a reassuring smile.
"It can hardly be as bad as that. Unless a whole mountain has fallen in front of the door, we shall find a way out."
The first thing to be done was to get rid of the door, and this Alan accomplished in summary fashion by undermining it with drills, and then, after he had sent everyone into the inner recesses of the caverns, tearing it to fragments with a small quantity of the explosives used in the shells. A mass of earth and stones came rolling into the gallery immediately after the explosion. Then an excavating machine was run up on hastily laid rails and was soon boring its way into the obstructing mass. A distance of 10 yards was tunnelled, and then there was a rattle and whir in front of the machine, which told that the work was done. There was a cloud of dust from the pulverized stones and earth, and then came a rush of fresh, warm air and a gleam of sunlight through the opening.
"Thank God the atmosphere is still there, and the sun is still shining,"
cried Alan as he drew the machine back and ran out into the open air. He looked about him for a few moments and then turned and walked back to his companions, who were already crowding towards the opening with faces glad with new hope, and drawing deep breaths of the life-giving air, which the mysterious alchemy of nature had restored unchanged to the earth. He stopped them with a gesture and said, "Don't go out yet till we have made the tunnel safe. You will find an awful change out yonder. Area is no longer a paradise. It is only a swamp surrounded by naked rocks." And so they found it to be, when they at length passed out through the tunnel and stood upon the black oozy shores of the dreary lake, which still half filled what had once been the lovely land of Area. The once verdure-clad mountains rose up bare and gaunt and blackened. A vast circle of ragged rock unrelieved by a blade of grass or a single tree of all the myriads that had clothed their slope 3 days before. It seemed as though the clock of time had been put back through countless ages, and the world was once more as it had been before the first forms of life appeared upon it. But still, the air that fanned their cheeks was fresh and warm and sweet, and the afternoon sun was shining across the western peaks out of a cloudless sky of purest blue. The calm had come after the storm, and the world was waiting to begin its life anew. The Alma and the Isma had utterly vanished, and were probably buried deep in the black slimy mud. Of the city of Area, not a vestige was visible. The first thing that Alan did as soon as the last momentous question had thus been asked and answered was to ask his father to order one of the smaller airships, which had been stored in sections in the cavern, to be put together and charged with motive power as rapidly as possible. "Certainly, if you wish it," he replied. "But what is your reason for being in such a hurry? To reassert your empire of the air?" "I can tell you now," said Alan in reply, "what there would have been no need to tell you if we had not been able to leave the caverns. Just after sunrise on the last day of the battle, Bruno Vincent brought the Orion as near as he could to the Alma, and told me by signal that he had seen the Revenge leave the fight and head away at full speed to the southward and westward. That means, I think, that Olga's courage failed her at the last, and that she meant to try the forlorn hope of saving herself in her old stronghold at Mount Terror. I am going to see whether she is alive or dead." "And suppose by a miracle you should find her alive, what then?" said Alma, who had overheard his request, coming up to him and looking up into his face with melting eyes as she slipped her hand, caressingly through his arm.
"The world is beginning its life anew in us, dear,"
he replied, with tenderness in his eyes, but none in his voice.
"And there shall be no snake, if you have to be the Cain of the new world to prevent it,"
interrupted Alma, reading his dark meaning at a glance, and interrupting it with a directness and force that startled him.
"No, Alan, this must not be. If she has escaped the vengeance of God, you may well forgo yours. I can hardly think that she is still alive, but it is right that we should go and see." "We?"
echoed Alan before she could finish.
"Do you mean that you will come with me?" "No, Alma, you must not do that. Remember that if she has by any chance escaped, the crew of the Revenge may be alive too, and then we may have to fight." "No, no, Alan, not that, not that,"
she cried with a gesture of horror.
"The world has done with fighting, for there is nothing left to fight about. We will go as friends with open hands to them, and the new life of the world shall be begun with the forgiveness of our enemies. Who are we that we should judge after the voice of God has spoken?"
In the end, she had her way. And so it came to pass that soon after sunrise on the following day, an airship, which 100 skilled and willing hands had toiled all night in fitting together and equipping for her voyage, rose into the air above the ghastly wilderness that had once been Aeria, and winged her way towards the southern pole. 20 hours later she sank down onto the ice that had already recovered the rocks in front of the fissure in the side of Mount Terror, and as she did so, a figure came forth out in the darkness into the half-light of the polar morning.
"Look, there she is,"
said Alma in an awe-stricken whisper to Alan.
"Alone in this awful place. Come, let us go to her."
As she spoke, the gangway steps were lowered, and she descended them first, followed by Alan, his father, Alexis, and Isma. Some strange influence held the others back as she advanced, with outstretched hands and words of kindly greeting on her lips towards the piteous wreck of womanhood that slowly emerged from the gloom of the chasm. Olga Romanoff had survived the doom of the world, but the hand of a just vengeance had fallen heavily upon her. Her once splendid form was shrunken, as though 60 years had passed over her in as many hours. Her left side was half paralyzed, and her shaking limbs hung loosely as she tottered along. Her golden fillet and jewelled wings had been cast away, leaving bare the great livid scar that crossed her forehead. Her white, drawn face was seamed with deep lines marked by agony and terror, and the thick masses of the once glorious hair that hung about her head and shoulders were streaked with grey and clotted with blood. The fire had died out of her eyes, and the red from her shrivelled lips, and the weak broken voice in which she answered Alma's greeting quavered like that of an old woman in her dotage.
"I have been expecting you,"
she said as Alma took her trembling hands in hers.
"I thought you would come. You have come for Alan, haven't you? He is yonder, but he is dead. I kept him alive as long as I could, but he was wounded. And when the world was changed to hell for my sins, the fire choked him. I tried to die too, but it wouldn't kill me. There was air enough for me, and I wanted to give it to him to breathe, but he wouldn't take it. I suppose you have been dead and are an angel now, like those others behind you. Come, I will take you to him. It is dark, but I know the way."
The moment she began to speak, Alma saw the awful calamity that had befallen her. The haughty, daring spirit that had essayed and almost achieved the conquest of the world was dissolved into the bitter waters of the Mara of madness. The soul that had quailed before no human fear had collapsed into imbecility under the superhuman terrors which she alone had witnessed and survived. Without a word, she suffered her to lead her into the gloom, beckoning to the others to follow. They turned on the electric lamps that they had brought with them, and entered the chasm. They reached the black ash-strewn floor of the gloomy subterranean lake in the heart of the mountain, and Alan, pausing for a moment, flashed the light of his lamp round the vast chamber that had once been so terribly familiar to him. The walls were burnt and blackened, and here and there masses of rock and boulders had been calcined to dust, as though the long pent-up lava that had once flowed in fiery torrents over them had again been let loose. Then the light fell upon something that was not rock, and which gave back a dull metallic sheen. He took a few strides towards it, and soon recognized it as all that was left of the once shapely and beautiful Ethereal, the old flagship of the Aryan fleet with which he had lost the mastery of his own manhood and his people, the Empire of the Air. The crystal dome of the roof was gone, and lay in patches of congealed glass about the blackened and shriveled up deck. The wings were burnt away, and the transverse ribs of Azarine stood out bare and twisted like the bones of a skeleton. And in the forepart of the hull a great gap showed where her magazine had taken fire and burnt with such terrific heat that it had melted even the Azarine plates of which she was built.
"The poor old Ethereal has flown her last flight,"
he said to himself with a sigh, as he turned away and followed the others, thinking sadly of all that had come to pass since he had last trodden her deck. Olga, holding Alma by the hand, led the way from the lower gallery to the council chamber. As she pulled the curtain aside from the doorway, a puff of foul air that seemed to bear a faint smell of blood was wafted into their faces. Alan called Alma back, fearing that she would faint in the sickening atmosphere, and at the sound of his voice Olga stopped short and looked back with a reawakening gleam in her eyes.
"Who is that?"
she cried, pressing her hands to her brow.
"Why, it is Alan. But no, Alan is here. He has been with me all the time since Caled shot him. My God! Can he have come to life again?"
Her voice rose to a shrill, wavering scream as she said this. She dropped Alma's hand and ran with faltering, stumbling steps towards a divan on which lay the form of a man whose black beard and moustache were thickly clotted with blood. She stopped and bent over it for a moment. Then she raised herself and faced them with her hands locked in her hair and the light of frenzied insanity blazing in her eyes.
"No, no!"
she cried in a voice half a scream and half a wail that rang weirdly through the great chamber.
"He is dead still, and that is only his ghost. Oh, Alan, my love, Alan, why could I not die with you? Curse the hands that wounded you, curse!"
In the one syllable her voice died away from a scream to a whisper, and at the same instant the paralysis which had already smitten her once laid its swift icy hand on her heart and brain. She swayed to and fro for a moment, and then fell forward across the corpse of the man whose love for her had plunged the world into madness on the eve of its doom.
"What an awful end,"
gasped Alma, shuddering in the close embrace she had sought in Alan's arms.
"And yet, Alan, she loved you to the end, through all. That love for you was the one true thing in her life. And for its sake, I will say, God forgive her. Come, let us go."
End of Olga Romanoff by George Griffith.